I'd like to express our protest in connection with the fact that the just started British presidency dealt with our two requests to convene a Security Council in connection with the horrific provocation of Ukrainian forces in Bucha. Now, from the beginning, the first meeting which we requested on the Sunday, 3rd of April, for Monday at 3 p.m., and then an emergency meeting which we requested at 12 o'clock on the 4th of April, after you refused our first request. We considered that it was possible to blatantly violate the rules of the council, and the second time issue a decision that wasn't coordinated with anyone, that it would be better to discuss this topic today. This is an outrageous situation set out in my letter to you yesterday as an official document of the council. I would like to ask you, on what basis do you feel that you can act in such an outrageous way in contravention of all existing norms and rules? Don't you know that in case you don't agree with our proposal, you should have convened a meeting and put forward the issue of the advisability of holding a meeting or a vote, especially since you should have had before you the example of our presidency, where we didn't refuse a single time to convene any of the 6 meetings on Ukraine. We demand an explanation from you, and we hope that in the future you will not challenge the right of members of the Security Council to request a meeting enshrined in Rule 2
of the Security Council at the request of any member of the Security Council.
Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation. Is there anyone else who wants to comment on this? I will explain the presidency's position in just a moment. Okay. If I could respond to your points from the Russian Federation, we did not reject your request for a meeting. We received your letter on Sunday, and it is the responsibility with the obligation of the presidency to schedule a meeting. You particularly requested a meeting for a time on Monday. Our proposal as presidency was to schedule the meeting either alongside the meeting today, so well within the 48-hour limit, which is the convention of the Security Council, or to hold the meetings sequentially, one after the other. And I understand that the Russian Federation turned down both proposals, but I wish to be clear that we did not reject the request for a meeting. The deferral proposed was less than 24 hours, and to be clear, we share the view that this is an urgent situation, and we have, as I say, offered the Russian Federation either a separate meeting today or to combine it with this one. And so as far as the presidency is concerned, we did everything in line with the provisional rules of procedure and with precedent. We have received no other complaints from council members on the subject. I give the floor to the Russian Federation.
Thank you. We have evidence, factual evidence, that this was no less than 24 hours before the meeting that we requested. This is confirmed in documents. If anyone is interested, we can provide proof. But I want to express the hope that what you said today means that you will not in the future refuse member states of the Security Council to hold the meetings when they request for it. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation. The presidency will not refuse to host meetings in the future, and I hope that that now closes that point and we can proceed with the adoption of the agenda. The provisional agenda for this meeting is letter dated the 28th of February 2014 from the Permanent Representative of Ukraine to the United Nations, addressed to the President of the Security Council, S/2014/136. The agenda is adopted. I should like to start by taking the opportunity to pay tribute on behalf of this council to Her Excellency Lana Naseba, the Permanent Representative of the United Arab Emirates, for your service as the President of the Council for the month of March. I'm sure I speak for all of us in expressing our deep appreciation to Ambassador Naseba and her team for the skillful conduct of the Council's business last month. Thank you very much indeed to your team. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. On behalf of the Council, I welcome the participation of His Excellency Mr. Volodymyr Zelenskiy, the President of Ukraine, and just add that, as usual precedent, the Permanent Representative of Ukraine will also join the meeting in case of any technical issues. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, Under Secretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, and Mr. Martin Griffiths, Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Emergency Relief Coordinator. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite His Excellency Mr. Olof Skog, Head of Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I wish to warmly welcome His Excellency the Secretary General, His Excellency Mr. Antonio Guterres, and I give him the floor.
Madam President, Excellencies, the war in Ukraine is one of the greatest challenges ever to the international order and the global peace architecture founded on the United Nations Charter, because of its nature, intensity, and consequences. We are dealing with the full-fledged invasion on several fronts of one member state of the United Nations, Ukraine, by another, the Russian Federation, a permanent member of the Security Council, in violation of the United Nations Charter, and with several aims, including redrawing the internationally recognized borders between the two countries. The war has led to senseless loss of life, massive devastation in urban centers, and the destruction of civilian infrastructure. I will never forget the horrifying images of civilians killed in Bucha, and I immediately called for an independent investigation to guarantee effective accountability. And I'm also deeply shocked by the personal testimony of rapes and sexual violence that now are emerging. The High Commissioner for Human Rights has spoken of possible war crimes, grave breaches of international humanitarian law, and serious violations of international human rights law. And the Russian offensive has also led to the displacement of more than 10 million people in just 1 month, the fastest forced population movement since the Second World War. Far beyond Ukraine's borders, the war has led to massive increases in prices of food, energy, and fertilizers, because Russia and Ukraine are linchpins of these markets. It has disrupted supply chains and increased the cost of transportation, putting even more pressure on the developing world. Many developing countries are already on the verge of debt collapse due to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and the lack of adequate liquidity and debt relief, stemming ultimately from the unfair nature of our global economic and financial system. For all these reasons, it is more urgent by the day to silence the guns. That is why I asked the Emergency Relief Coordinator, Martin Griffiths, to travel to Russia and Ukraine to press for an urgent humanitarian ceasefire. And the Secretary-General Griffiths will update you on the humanitarian situation and the results of his contacts so far. And the Secretary-General Di Carlo will also brief you on the political and human rights dimensions. But as Secretary-General of the United Nations, it is my duty to call the attention of the Council to the serious damage being done to the global economy and particularly to vulnerable people and developing countries. Madam President, our analysis indicates that 74 developing countries with a total population of 1.2 billion people are particularly vulnerable to spiking food, energy, and fertilizer costs. Debt obligations take up some 16% of developing countries' export earnings, and in small island developing states, the figure is 34% and rising because of increased interest rates and the need to pay for expensive imports. In the past months alone, wheat prices have increased by 22%, maize by 21%, and barley by 31%. Brent oil prices on the 1st of April were more than 60% higher than at the same time last year. A series of events have led to that, not only the present situation. Natural gas and fertilizer prices more than double over the same period. We are already seeing some countries move from vulnerability into crisis and signs of serious social unrest. The flames of conflict are fueled by inequality, deprivation, and underfunding. With all the warning signals flashing red, we have a duty to act. Madam President, the Global Crisis Response Group on Food, Energy and Finance that I set up last month has formulated some initial recommendations for the consideration of member states, international financial institutions, and others. On food, we are urging all countries to keep markets open, resist unjustified and unnecessary export restrictions, and make reserves available to countries at risk of hunger and famine. This is not the time for protectionism. Humanitarian appeals must be fully funded. People caught up in crisis around the world cannot pay the price for this war. On energy, the use of strategic stockpiles and additional reserves could help ease this energy crisis in the short term. But the only medium and long-term solution is to accelerate the deployment of renewable energy, which is not impacted by market fluctuations. These will allow the progressive phase-out of coal and other fossil fuels, and renewables are already cheaper in most of the cases. And on finance, international financial institutions must go into emergency mode. We need urgent action by the G20 and international financial institutions to increase liquidity and fiscal space so that governments can provide safety nets for the poorest and most vulnerable. The reform I've been calling for the global financial system is long overdue. All these actions are closely linked with the prevention agenda and with building and sustaining peace. Madam President, the war in Ukraine must stop now. We need serious negotiations for peace based on the principles of the United Nations Charter. This Council is charged with maintaining peace and doing so in solidarity. I deeply regret the divisions that have prevented the Security Council from acting not only on Ukraine, but on other threats to peace and security around the world. I urge the Council to do everything in its power to end the war and to mitigate its impact, both on the suffering people of Ukraine and on vulnerable people and developing countries around the world, and I thank you.
I thank the Secretary-General for his remarks. I now give the floor to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo.
Thank you. Madam President, since I last briefed this Council on 17 March, the security situation in Ukraine has seriously deteriorated. The number of Ukrainian civilians killed has more than doubled. Ukrainian cities continue to be mercilessly pounded, often indiscriminately, by heavy artillery and aerial bombardments. And hundreds of thousands of people, including children, the elderly, and the disabled, remain trapped in encircled areas under nightmarish conditions. The devastation wrought on Mariupol and other Ukrainian cities is one of the shameful hallmarks of this senseless war. The horror deepened this past weekend as shocking images emerged of dead civilians, some with hands bound, lying in the streets of Bucha, the town near Kiev formerly held by Russian forces. Many bodies were also found in a mass grave in the same locality. Reports by non-governmental organizations and media also allege summary executions of civilians, rape and looting in Chernihiv, Kharkiv, and Kiev regions. Madam President, away from the fighting, diplomatic efforts to end this war, including direct talks between Ukrainian and Russian representatives, have continued. We commend the government of Turkey for hosting these discussions, as well as the efforts of many others engaging with Russia and Ukraine to help bring about peace. We welcome the willingness of the sides to continue engaging to reach a mutual understanding. This requires good faith and earnest efforts, and progress in the negotiations should be translated quickly into action on the ground. While there has been a reported reduction of Russian troops in attacks around Kiev and Chernihiv, such moves should not be merely tactical, repositioning forces for renewed attacks on Ukrainian cities and towns elsewhere. The General Assembly has twice called for Russian forces to withdraw entirely from Ukrainian territory and cease all military operations. We also take note of the reported withdrawal of Russian forces from around the Chernobyl nuclear site. The International Atomic Energy Agency reports that this development will hopefully allow it to conduct an assistance and support mission to provide technical advice and to deliver equipment where necessary as soon as possible. All nuclear sites in Ukraine must be fully protected and secured. Military operations in or around these locations must be avoided. Madam President, the numbers tell a tragic, if yet incomplete story. According to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, at least 1,480 civilians have been killed and at least 2,195 injured between 24 February and 4 April 2022. OHCHR believes that the actual figures are considerably higher. We are gravely concerned by the persistent use of explosive weapons with the wide impact area in or near populated areas. Such weapons are causing most civilian casualties, as well as massive destruction of civilian infrastructure, including residential buildings, hospitals, schools, water stations, and electricity systems. OHCHR has received credible allegations that Russian forces have used cluster munitions in populated areas at least 24 times. Allegations that Ukrainian forces have used such weapons are also being investigated. As noted by the High Commissioner, indiscriminate attacks are prohibited under international humanitarian law and may amount to war crimes. The massive destruction of civilian objects and the high number of civilian casualties strongly indicate that the fundamental principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution have not been sufficiently adhered to. In besieged cities, a significant increase in mortality rates among civilians can also be attributed to the disruption of medical care and basic services. People with disabilities and the elderly are particularly vulnerable. As of 4 April 2022, the World Health Organization has reported a total of 85 attacks on healthcare facilities, resulting in at least 72 fatalities and 43 injuries. Madam President, we are seriously concerned about reports of cases of arbitrary arrests and enforced disappearances of persons who have been vocal against the Russian invasion. As of 30 March, OHCHR has documented the arbitrary detention and possible enforced disappearance of 22 journalists and civil society members in Kiev, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia regions. 24 local officials have also been detained in regions under Russian control, 13 of whom have been subsequently released. We call for the immediate release of all individuals who have been arbitrarily detained, including journalists, local officials, civil society activists, and others. Also, as of 30 March, OHCHR has recorded 7 journalists and media workers killed since hostilities began. Another 15 have come under armed attack, 9 of whom were injured. Allegations of conflict-related sexual violence perpetrated by Russian forces have also emerged. These include gang rape and rapes in front of children. There are also claims of sexual violence by Ukrainian forces and civil defense militias. The UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine continues to seek to verify all these allegations. We're also concerned about disturbing videos depicting abuse of prisoners of war on both sides. All prisoners of war must be treated with dignity and full respect for their rights in accordance with international humanitarian law. Madam President, the many credible allegations of serious violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law from areas recently retaken from Russian forces must not go unanswered. We support efforts to examine these allegations and to gather evidence. Ensuring accountability and justice for acts committed during the war will not be easy, but it is essential. Madam President, we are heartened by the generosity of neighboring countries who have accepted millions of refugees and the solidarity of the Ukrainian people who are hosting their displaced compatriots. With more than 10 million people displaced, either within Ukraine or abroad as refugees, roughly 1/4 of the population, the United Nations is gravely concerned about the heightened risk of human trafficking. Indeed, suspected and verified cases of human trafficking are surfacing in the surrounding countries, according to the International Organization for Migration. Madam President, this war is devastating Ukraine now, but it also threatens its future. Early assessment projections by UNDP suggest that if the war continues through 2022, Ukraine faces the prospect of seeing 18 years of socioeconomic progress lost. This would set the country and the region back decades and leave deep long-term social and economic fissures. UN agencies, including UNDP, are working to help preserve Ukraine's hard-won development gains. This involves supporting the government to sustain essential government structures and basic services, including emergency measures to sustain livelihoods, such as cash-based assistance. Madam President, the war in Ukraine has damaged Europe's security architecture. Its economic repercussions are already evident far from the battlefield. The longer the war continues, the greater the risk that it will further weaken the global institutions and mechanisms dedicated to preserve peace and security. The war was started by choice. There is no inevitability to it or to the suffering it is causing. The United Nations is ready to do everything within its means to help bring an end to it. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Mr. Carlo for her briefing. And I now give the floor to Mr. Martin Griffiths.
Thank you, Madam President. As you've just heard from the Secretary General and Under Secretary General De Carlo, Ukrainian civilians are paying far too high a price for this war. I want to speak briefly about humanitarian needs and what we're doing to meet them before I then refer to my recent travels. In the last 6 weeks, as we have heard, at least 1,430 people have been killed, among them over 121 children, and we know this is very likely a serious underestimate. Homes and civilian infrastructure, bridges, hospitals, schools have been damaged and destroyed. And in fact, the current figures on displacement tell us that more than 11.3 million people have now been forced to flee their homes, and of that, 4.2 million are now refugees in those generous neighboring countries that Rosemary has just been referring to. So in total, more than 1/4 of the population of Ukraine has fled in this extraordinary short time. Unfortunately, we can imagine that these figures will continue to rise until we can find a pause and some peace. Madam President, the ground and air offensives and counteroffensives are making life nearly impossible for many civilians in Ukraine. Families, the elderly, women and children have been trapped by fighting already for too long. For more than 5 weeks, the people of Mariupol have been caught up in the fighting. And it is well documented that really Mariupol is a center of hell. Other cities like Chernihiv, Sumy and Kharkiv remain cut off from essential goods and services. And perilous conditions are hampering our efforts to access civilians or for them to access us. And we restate here that civilians must be allowed to move to safer areas without the fear of attacks and at their own choice and at their own selection. It's vital that all parties to the conflict respect their obligations under international humanitarian law to protect civilians and to allow impartial humanitarian organizations safe, rapid, unimpeded access to all civilians in need wherever they are in Ukraine. Madam President, as the world watches humanitarian needs soar in Ukraine, the United Nations and our partner organizations are making every effort to dramatically increase our support to affected civilians. The work of the 6,000 volunteers from the Ukraine Red Cross, as we have noted before in this chamber, together with local NGOs in eastern Ukraine, these people, these organizations continue to work tirelessly at the front line of assistance to communities. The World Food Programme has reached more than 1.3 million people with cash and food assistance and plans to push that number up to 2.5 million people in this month. Health partners report that more than 180 tons of medical supplies were delivered in Ukraine, with another 470 tons on the way. And this will address the health needs of around 6 million people in the months ahead. And I'm pleased to say, that seems an odd word to say in the context of Ukraine, that after much effort in the past day, another convoy went from our humanitarian hub in Dnipro to the Far East. Today, food, winter clothing, non-food items, medicine, hygiene kits were offloaded to the Ukraine Red Cross and will reach the hands of those most in need. Indeed, following notification to both parties, a formal process that we and also the International Red Cross are engaged in, 4 convoys in total from the UN have provided critical support to people in some of the cities encircled by war, and affected by ongoing fighting. Several more are planned. So these are initial steps, but it gives us a basis to now expand and taking our efforts up to scale and expanding much more than 1 convoy a day. As the Secretary General and the Under-Secretary General has already said, I want to also join them in expressing my concern over the growing number of reports we receive of human trafficking, sexual violence, exploitation, and abuse in Ukraine and in the region. And as ever, such horrific incidents as we're seeing, they overwhelmingly impact displaced women and children more than others. We're bolstering protection and gender-based violence services through agencies to provide specialized care for survivors and through the wealth of civil society organizations in Ukraine. These services are designed, carried out directly in collaboration with and through Ukrainian civil society, including, very particularly, women-led organizations. Madam President, today I'm addressing you from Geneva, having just returned from Moscow overnight. As you know, the Secretary General, as he said, charged me to bring both sides together on humanitarian grounds to explore both specific and sustained ways to reduce humanitarian suffering, including in particular, inter alia, but in particular, the pursuit of a humanitarian ceasefire. Yesterday in Moscow, I had long and frank exchanges with the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Lavrov, and his deputy, Sergei Vershinin. and then separately with Alexander Fomin, the Deputy Minister of Defense. In my meetings with these senior officials, I discussed also, in addition to these possibilities of humanitarian ceasefires, I discussed the issue of humanitarian convoys of safe passage, including the 4 which I've already referred to. I outlined possibilities for building further on that cooperation, sharing specific suggestions for mutually agreed upon military freezes to allow for evacuation of civilians and for the safe passage of life-saving aid. In effect, for humanitarian pauses in different parts of Ukraine to save lives and bring back a modicum of safety for those living in those places. My counterparts in Moscow received these suggestions, assured me of their intent to carefully study those ideas, which I left with them. And we agreed to remain in close contact. And I came away from these meetings believing that we have a very long road ahead of us, but it must be traveled. And Madam President, we will travel it. Tomorrow I plan to travel to Ukraine to have discussions with senior authorities from the Ukrainian government in Kyiv on Thursday on these same issues and others that they will no doubt present to me, and also to see firsthand with our crisis coordinator, Amin Awad, the humanitarian response. Madam President, thanks to generous donor contributions, many from governments in this chamber, the humanitarian response since February has indeed been scaled up, allowing us to meet the needs of 1.5 million people. We will need sustained financial support for needs in Ukraine. And like the Secretary General, I want to stress, as he has done consistently, that funding must not be diverted from other crises. And Madam President, for Afghanistan, that is one example. And as you heard from David Beasley last week, conflict, climate shocks, COVID, compounded by the soaring food and fuel costs indicated by the Secretary General, could push another 47 million people globally into severe food insecurity. And so the total number of people around the world who will not know where their next meal comes from could be driven to the astonishing figure of 325 million people around the world. That is by a long distance the highest in our recent history, and well over double what it was 3 years ago. So, Madam President, I close, of course, like others, by reminding the Council of what the Council already knows well. The world cannot afford this war, and neither can the people of Ukraine. And like others, I call on all Council members and member states with influence to support all efforts from whatever part they come from in the pursuit of peace and the alleviation of humanitarian suffering, for the sake of the people of Ukraine, for the sake of those around the world who cannot afford to bear the additional burden this war imposes on them and all of us. We must, as the Secretary General said, silence the guns. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Mr. Griffiths for his briefing. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Volodymyr Zelenskiy, the President of Ukraine. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, dear Madam Chairman, dear Mr. Secretary General, distinguished members of the Security Council and other members of this meeting. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm sure that all the representatives of the United Nations member states will hear me today. Yesterday, I returned from our city of Bucha, recently liberated from Russian troops, not far from Kyiv. So there is not a single crime that they would not commit there. The Russian military search for and purposefully killed anyone who served our country. They shot and killed women outside their houses when they just tried to call someone who is alive. They killed entire families, adults and children, and they tried to burn the bodies. I am addressing you on behalf of the people who honor the memory of the deceased every single day, in the memory of the civilians who died, who were shot or killed in the back of their head after being tortured. Some of them were shot on the streets, others were thrown into the wells, so they died there in suffering. They were killed in their apartments, houses, blowing up grenades. The civilians were crushed by tanks while sitting in their cars in the middle of the road, just for their pleasure. They cut off limbs, cut their throats, slashed their throats. Women were raped and killed in front of their children. Their tongues were pulled out only because the aggressor did not hear what they wanted to hear from them. So this is no different from other terrorists such as Daesh, who occupied some territories. And here it is done by a member of the United Nations Security Council, destroying internal unity, borders, countries, and taking the right of more than a dozen countries who are self-determined and independent. They pursue a consistent policy of destroying ethnic and religious diversity. They inflame wars and deliberately lead them in such a way that to kill as many regular civilians and cities, to leave the country where they deploy their troops in ruins and filled with mass graves. You all see that. And they support hatred at the level of the state and seek to export it to other countries through their system of propaganda and political corruption. They provoke a global food crisis that could lead to famine in Africa, Asia, and other countries, and will surely end in large-scale political chaos in many countries, and destroying their domestic security. So where is the security that the Security Council needs to guarantee? It's not there, although there is a Security Council. So where is the peace? Where are those guarantees that the United Nations needs to guarantee? It is obvious that the key institution of the world, which must ensure the coercion of any aggressor to peace, simply cannot work effectively. Now the world can see that what Russian military did in Bucha while keeping the city under their occupation, but the world has yet to see what they have done in other occupied cities and regions of our country. Geography might be different or various, but cruelty is the same, crimes are the same, and accountability must be inevitable. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to remind you of Article 1, Chapter 1 of the UN Charter. What is the purpose of our organization? Its purpose is to maintain peace and make sure that peace is adhered to. And now the UN Charter is violated literally, starting with Article 1. And if so, what is the point of all other articles? Today, as a result of Russia's actions in our country, in Ukraine, the most terrible war crimes of all times we see since the end of World War II, and they are being committed. Russians troops are deliberately destroying Ukrainian cities to ashes with artillery and airstrike. They are deliberately blocking cities, creating mass starvation. They deliberately shoot columns of civilians on the road trying to escape from the territory of hostilities. They even deliberately blow up shelters where civilians hide from airstrike. They are deliberately creating conditions in the temporarily occupied territories so that as many civilians as possible are killed there. The massacre in our city of Bucha is only one, unfortunately, only one of many examples of what the occupiers have been doing on our land for the past 41 days. And there are many more cities, similar places where the world has yet to learn the full truth. Mariupol, Kharkiv, Chernobyl, Tyrka, Borodyanka, and dozens other Ukrainian communities, each of them is similar to Bucha. I know, and you know perfectly well what the representatives of Russia will say in response to the accusations of these crimes. They have said that many times. The most significant was after the shooting down of the Malaysian Boeing over Donbass by Russian forces with Russian weapons, or during the war in Syria. They will blame everyone just to justify their own actions. They will say that there are various versions, different versions, and it is impossible to establish which one of those versions is true. They will even say that the bodies were of those kills were allegedly thrown away, and all videos are staged. But it is 2022 now. We have conclusive evidence, so there are satellite images. We can conduct full and transparent investigation. That is what we are interested in. Maximum access for journalists, maximum cooperation with international institutions, involvement of the International Criminal Court, complete truth and full accountability. I'm sure that every member state of the UN should be interested in this. For what? In order to punish once and for all those who consider themselves privileged and believe that they can get away with anything. So show all the other potential war criminals in the world how they will be punished. If the biggest one is punished, then everyone is punished. And why did Ukraine come to Ukraine? I will tell you, because Russia's leadership feels like colonizers. In ancient times, they need our wealth, our people. Russia has already deported hundreds of thousands of our citizens to their country. They abducted more than 2,000 children, just simply conducted those children and continue to do so. Russia wants to turn Ukraine into silent slaves. The Russian military are looting openly the cities and villages they have captured. This is wide-scale looting. They are stealing everything, starting with food, ending with earrings, gold earrings that are pulled out and covered with blood. We are dealing with a state that is turning the veto into the UN Security Council into the right to die. This undermines the whole architecture of global security. It allows them to go unpunished. So they are destroying everything that they can. So if this continues, the countries will rely only on the power of their own arms to ensure their security, and not on international law, not rely on international institutions. The United Nations can be simply closed. Ladies and gentlemen, are you ready to close the UN? Do you think that the time of international law is gone? If your answer is no, then you need to act immediately. The UN Charter must be restored immediately. The UN system must be reformed immediately so that the veto is not the right to die, that there is a fair representation in the Security Council of all regions of the world. The aggressor must be brought to peace immediately. Determination is needed. The massacre from Syria to Somalia, from Afghanistan to Yemen and Libya, that should have been stopped a long time ago, to tell you the truth. If tyranny had at least once received such a response to the war it had waged, it would have ceased to exist, and honest peace had been guaranteed after it, and the world would have changed for sure. And then perhaps there would not be war in my country against our people, against Ukrainian people, against our citizens, but the world watched and did not want to see either the occupation of Crimea or the war against Georgia or taking the entire Transnistria from Moldova, and how Russia was preparing the basis for other conflicts and wars near their borders. how to stop it.
Негайно притягувати російських військових і тих, хто віддав їм накази, до відповідальності за воєнні злочини на території України. Кожен, хто віддав злочинні накази і хто їх виконував, вбиваючи людей, опиняться під трибуналом, який має бути аналогічним Нюрнберзькому процесу. Я хочу нагадати дипломатам Росії, що після Другої світової війни покарання не оминуло таку людину, як фон Ріббентроп. І хочу нагадати також архітекторам злочинної політики Росії, що покарання наздогнало і Адольфа Айхмана. Ніхто з винних не сховається. Ніхто. Але головне, що сьогодні саме час трансформувати систему. Режим якої є Організація Об'єднаних Націй. Щоб це зробити, пропонуємо скликати глобальну конференцію. І ми просимо це зробити вже у мирному Києві. Для того, щоб визначити, як будемо реформувати світову систему безпеки, як будемо реально гарантувати непорушність загальновизнаних кордонів і цілісність держави, як будемо утверджувати верховенство міжнародного права. Зараз цілком очевидно, що цілі, які закладали Сан-Франциско в 1945 році при створенні глобальної безпекової міжнародної організації, не досягнуті. І досягнути їх без реформ неможливо. А отже, ми повинні зробити все, що від нас залежить, щоб передати наступним поколінням дієву ООН з можливістю превентивно реагувати на безпекові виклики, а отже, і гарантувати мир, запобігати агресії і примусувати агресорів до миру, мати рішучість і змогу карати, якщо принципи миру порушуються. Виключень привілеїв буде більше не може. Всі мають бути рівними. Усі учасники міжнародних відносин, незалежно від економічної сили, географічної площі та індивідуальних амбіцій. Домінуючою має стати сила миру, сила справедливості, це сила безпеки, як про це людство завжди і мріяло. Україна готова дати майданчик для одного з головних офісів оновленої системи безпеки. Як офіс в Женеві спеціалізується на правах людини, як офіс в Найробі на захисті навколишнього середовища, так офіс в Києві, офіс Ю-24 може спеціалізуватись на превентивних заходах для підтримання миру. Я хочу нагадати нашу мирну місію в Афганістані. Коли тільки за рахунок своїх сил ми, українці, евакуювали з цієї країни понад 1000 людей. І була найгарячіша фаза, але люди потребували допомоги. І Україна прийшла, і як і інші держави. Ми забрали звідти людей різних національностей, різної віри. Тільки українці, громадян європейських держав, Сполучених Штатів, Канади. Ми не дивились, хто потребує допомоги. Це наша людина або не наша людина. Ми рятували усіх. Якби кожного разу, коли є така потреба, кожен у світі мав впевненість, що допомога прийде світу, був однозначно безпечніший. Тому Україна має необхідне моральне право, щоб пропонувати реформу світової системи безпеки. Ми довели, що допомагаємо іншим не тільки у щасті, але і в темні часи. І зараз ми потребуємо рішень Ради безпеки для миру в Україні. Якщо ви не знаєте, як ухвалити це рішення, то ви можете зробити дві речі. Або усунути Росію як агресора і джерело війни, відблокування рішень щодо її агресії, її ж війни. І тоді зробити все, що може встановити мир, або покажіть, як можна переформувати владу і працювати реально заради миру. Або, якщо ваш чинний формат безальтернативний і виходу просто немає, то далі тільки саморозпуск. Я переконаний, що ви здатні обійти весь третій варіант. Мир потрібен Україні. Мир потрібен нам. Мир
besides
потрібен
conversation.
Європі,
We
мир
need peace.
потрібен світу.
Ukraine needs
І на сам
peace.
кінець
Europe needs peace.
я
And the world needs
дуже
peace.
прошу вас
And
зараз,
finally, I would kindly ask you
перегляньте
very
відео,
much to watch
невеличке.
this short video.
Дайте нам ще одну хвилину.
Please
Відео
give
про те,
us
що
one more
прийшло
minute
на
of your
заміну
time. The
вашій
video
силі через те, що
that
хтось
we
один може
want to show
зловживати
that
своїми правами.
one country
Ось до
can
чого
violate
призводить безкарність.
rights. And
Якщо
that's
є можливість,
the result
подивіться
of
це
being
відео,
unpunished.
тому що
If
можливості
possible,
усіх приїхати
please
до нас
watch
і
this video because
побачити
it is
це
impossible to get
немає.
everyone to
Тож
come to our
подивіться
country and
цей
see
фрагмент.
it with your own eyes. Therefore, I would ask you to watch this video. Thank you very much.
Piece of video. They have the video. They have to. I'm not sure. The video, is it just coming?
Madam President, the video has been uploaded to the technicians of the Security Council. So they have it in their possession.
We will sort that one out. Technically, we don't have the video. So I propose that while we sort that out, I thank His Excellency Mr. Zelensky for his compelling and powerful remarks. We will come back to the video when we've sorted out the technical issues around it. And may I say, speaking in my national capacity, may I express appreciation to the President for his leadership in wartime and for the extraordinary fortitude and bravery of the Ukrainian people under this unprovoked and illegal invasion. I resume my function as the President of the Security Council, and while we sort out the technical video, I propose to give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. And I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me also start by thanking UAE and Ambassador Nisibeh for her successful presidency during the month of March. Madam President, as you begin your Security Council presidency, I want to thank the United Kingdom for your leadership and for organizing this vital discussion on Ukraine today. I also want to thank the Secretary General for his remarks and the other briefers. And I'd like to extend a warm welcome to President Zelensky. I was so moved by the address he made recently to our Congress, and we are truly honored by his presence here under the circumstances that he and Ukraine face today. Madam President, last night I returned from a trip to Moldova and Romania. I saw with my own eyes the refugee crisis caused by Russia's unconscionable war. I spoke to refugees who indicated to me their desires to return to their home. And we've all seen the images on TV of the bombed out buildings. But what we have not seen is that behind those destroyed buildings are destroyed lives and destroyed families. I met with women and children who had fled Ukraine, who stuffed their lives into backpacks and left the only home they had ever known. And these were sobering conversations. One young woman I spoke to came with her 6-year-old brother who had autism and is struggling with cancer. Their single mother helped them escape to save their lives. But Russia's war has interrupted the care her brother desperately needs. Another woman I spoke to fled with her 8-year-old from Odessa. The father, who they'd left behind, told them there was shelling right next to their apartment that very night. And they very well could have died had they not left. A third woman I met told me that she used to love to travel, but never expected her next trip would be to flee for her life. When I asked her where she was from, she started to say, and then she stopped with tears in her eyes and said, "I'm sorry. I don't know how to say it, whether I live in Kyiv or whether I used to live in Kyiv." She was realizing in the moment just how dramatically her life had changed because of this senseless war. These are 3 stories of more than 10 million people, 6 million internally displaced, 4 million who have left Ukraine altogether, 4 million people who have relied on the big-heartedness of countries like Moldova, Romania, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and others across the region and the world to welcome and support all those leaving Ukraine in search of safety. Ukraine's neighbors are bearing the brunt of Europe's most significant refugee crisis since World War II. And I want these countries to know that they have a committed partner in the United States. And that is why the United States announced recently that we are prepared to provide more than $1 billion in new funding toward humanitarian assistance for those affected by Russia's war in Ukraine and its severe impact around the world. And it is why we are welcoming up to 100,000 Ukrainians and others fleeing Russia's aggression to the United States. We will continue to assist humanitarian efforts to help the people of Ukraine and all those fleeing Putin's violence. But as heart-wrenching as the stories are that I heard in Moldova and Romania, there are some stories we will never get to hear. Those of the people we saw in the images out of Bucha. We've all seen the gruesome photos. Lifeless bodies lying in the streets, apparently summarily executed, their hands tied behind their backs. As we work to independently confirm the events depicted in these images, I would remind this council that based on the currently available information, the United States has assessed that members of Russia's forces have committed war crimes in Ukraine. And even before seeing the images from Bucha, President Zelensky, along with others in the region, were reporting that children were being abducted. And we heard him say that today. Also abducted are mayors and doctors, religious leaders, journalists, and all who dare defy Russia's aggression. Some of them, according to credible reports, including by the Mariupol City Council, have been taken to so-called filtration camps, where Russian forces are reportedly making tens of thousands of Ukrainian citizens relocate to Russia. Reports indicate that Russian federal security agents are confiscating passports and IDs, taking away cell phones, and separating families from one another. I do not need to spell out what these so-called filtration camps are reminiscent of. It's chilling, and we cannot look away. Every day, we see more and more how little Russia respects human rights. And that is why I announced yesterday that the United States, in coordination with Ukraine and many other UN member states, will seek Russia's suspension from the UN Human Rights Council. Given the growing mountain of evidence, Russia should not have a position of authority in a body whose very purpose is to promote respect for human rights. Not only is this the height of hypocrisy, it is dangerous. Russia is using its membership on the Human Rights Council as a platform for propaganda to suggest Russia has a legitimate concern for human rights. In fact, we will hear some of that propaganda here today, I know. And I will not dignify these lies with a response, only to say that every lie we hear from the Russian representative is more evidence that they do not belong on the Human Rights Council. 140 UN member states voted to condemn Russia over its unprovoked war and the humanitarian crisis it has unleashed upon the people of Ukraine. Here's my message to all of you. Now is the time to match those words with action and show the world that we can work responsibly. And I share President Zelenskyy's view that this moment requires responsible world powers and global leaders to show some backbone and stand up to Russia's dangerous and unprovoked threat against Ukraine and the world. The Secretary General said that confronting this threat is the Security Council's charge. It is, and it is also the responsibility of UN leaders and leaders around the world, every single member state with a voice in the GA. No one can be a shield for Russia's aggression. Suspending Russia from the Human Rights Council is something we collectively have the power to do in the General Assembly. Our votes can make a real difference. Russia's participation on the Human Rights Council hurts the Council's credibility. It undermines the entire UN, and it is just plain wrong. Let us come together to do what is right and do right by the Ukrainian people. Let us take this step to help them to start to rebuild their lives. And let us match the courage of President Zelensky, who we are so honored to have with us today. President Zelensky, I want you to know that we stand with the people of Ukraine as you face down this brutal attack on your sovereignty, on your democracy, and on your freedom. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for her statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me thank Ambassador Nusibe for having steered our work during the month of March and wish the UK and you, Madam President, full success in our common work during this month. Albania welcomes President Zelenskyy's presence to this meeting. His remarks are painful, and his account on what Ukraine is experiencing under Russian occupation is revolting. We stand by you, Mr. President, by your compatriots, all Ukrainians, for their heroic resistance, for their resilience that the entire world is admiring. You are not alone. You have the world on your side, because it's the side of the right, of the just, and as we hope, of victory. Slava Ukraini. Madam President, let me thank SG Guterres for his, again, very clear and powerful remarks. I also thank USG DiCarlo and Griffiths for their updates. This is the 14th meeting of the Security Council on Ukraine since the 31st of January, while the war of aggression has entered the second month. Let's establish a few basic yet meaningful facts. Russia has stalled and its imperial dreams are nowhere. Taking Ukraine finally proved impossible. Kiev was too hard to swallow. Russian army is in disarray, but it has not stopped shelling and bombardments. But all this is not new, and all this is not news. The real news that has horrified the world is what Russia is leaving behind. The unspeakable horrors, those soul-crushing images in areas from which Russia is withdrawing. images of civilians executed with a bullet in the neck, sometimes with their hands tied behind their backs or shot dead in their bicycles. Images of mass graves overflowing with corpses. Images of carnage and devastation, including looted homes, rape, and sexual violence, acts usually attributed only to thugs. They spring from the same cruel impulses as the bombardment of cities, homes, hospitals, schools, and kindergartens by the Russian forces. Bucha is an open-air graveyard, the notorious facelift of the Russian aggression. Madam President, we have heard time and again, it is not Russia. Yes, but no. It will be hard, actually impossible, to convince anyone that the destroyed tanks that clutter the roads, the mines and booby traps left behind amid the wreckage, and the bodies of civilians killed by arbitrary executions and laying in the streets amidst debris are staged scenes for propaganda. Who would believe that Russia aggressed Ukraine simply to protect civilians, while Ukraine is busy staging horror movies? You may muzzle media back home, but you cannot fool satellite images. You cannot blind independent reporters and human rights NGOs on the ground. Waiting for Russia to accept and tell the truth is waiting for Godot to arrive, and he never does. These are facts, hard and sickening proof of the atrocities committed, the ugly face of this madness. Such crimes, as documented by Human Rights Watch and verified by independent and respected professional reporters, those who are banned for the Russians call for answers, call for thorough investigation, for effective accountability, for justice. Prime Minister Rama called these crimes a terrible pain and a horrible shame. Russia has an international obligation to abide by international humanitarian law, the laws of war, including the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and its first additional protocol. Russia has an obligation to abide by the order of ICJ to immediately halt its military activity in Ukraine. But unfortunately, Russia has made another choice, not to respect any of it, and has cancelled itself from international law. But the law will pursue it. Russian army and its commanders cannot escape accountability. The name of the butcher of Mariupol, a criminal that has reduced an entire city to ashes and has made its citizens go from 3 meals a day to barely 3 meals a week, is engraved in the ruins of the city. This is why we will support the call to suspend Russia's participation in the Human Rights Council. The UNGA resolution that created the Council stipulates that, and I quote, members of the Council will respect the highest standards in the promotion and protection of human rights. As we see, Russia's standards are nose-eating, and its presence there is a farce, a desecration of the place that is called to be the sanctuary of rights. Dear colleagues, Russia has announced that it will now shift its focus on eastern Ukraine. This means that it will concentrate its brutality there in what may end up becoming a war of attrition. Russia has blocked the renewal of the OSCE International Observer Mission in Ukraine. This denies the international community the independent eyes it needs there. This anticipates, sadly, more war, further atrocities, other crimes, even more humanitarian disasters. This war continues to particularly affect women and children. Millions have been displaced, many of them alone, in search of safety and security. It is heartbreaking to see mothers write names and addresses in the back of their children so that they are recognized in case they end up being orphans. We welcome the efforts of OCHA and its partners to deliver assistance in support of the people in Ukraine and the millions of refugees in neighboring countries. Madam President, let me end with this note. Rarely has the outcome of a war been so disastrously the complete opposite of what it wanted to achieve. Russia's army has been defeated by the outgunned and outnumbered Ukrainian resistance. Russia is isolated like never in its history. It has become the world's most sanctioned country in history. No country has ever seen itself transform in a matter of only 10 days from a global player into a financial and international pariah, to the point that it is obliged to find comfort in the support from North Korea and Syria. Dear colleagues, this aggression and its startling defeat have once and for all separated the fates of Ukrainians and Russians, because the case of Ukraine is also the cause of democracy against tyranny and kleptocracy. It is a fight between the will of the people against the vicious will of one whose reckless actions have challenged everything we stand for, and who is directly responsible for the economic disruption and food insecurity which is affecting the entire world. He may choose to stop, withdraw troops, and quit Ukraine, or continue to descend in the very abyss he has created and face the consequences. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for his statement. I understand that we now have solved the technical problems, so I suggest we return to the video. Thank you. I would like to thank the delegation of Ukraine for sharing that video with us. The images are harrowing. Speaking in my national capacity, we are appalled by what we have seen and reiterate our solidarity with Ukraine. I resume my function as the Council President, and I now give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Je voudrais d'abord exprimer mon appréciation à l'ambassadeur des Émirats arabes unis pour sa présidence remarquable. Je remercie le secrétaire général, Monsieur Antonio Guterres, la secrétaire générale adjointe, Madame Rosemary DiCarlo, ainsi que Monsieur Martin Griffiths pour leurs exposés respectifs. Je salue la participation à cette réunion du président Zelensky. Madame la Présidente, nous continuons d'assister impuissants à la guerre en Ukraine. Pendant que se déroule le décompte macabre des morts et des personnes déplacées, et que les combats se poursuivent au même rythme que la courbe des statistiques, les pertes en hommes et en infrastructures civiles ne cessent de s'accroître. Un jour de guerre est décidément un jour de trop. Alors que le conflit est dans sa 6e semaine, le nombre de personnes déplacées dépasse à présent les 10 millions, dont près de 4 millions de réfugiés dans les pays voisins. Il s'agit d'une catastrophe humanitaire effroyable, dont les répercussions seront sans doute aggravées par les risques d'insécurité alimentaire dus à l'imprévisibilité des récoltes, avec là aussi des effets transrégionaux. will
Je
in
voudrais
turn
à cet
have
égard saluer
trans-regional
la
knock-on
mise en place
effects.
par le secrétaire
I'd
général
like to welcome
d'un
the
groupe de
Secretary
travail sur
General's
l'alimentation,
establishment of a working
l'énergie
group task
et les
force
finances
on
pour réduire
food
l'impact de la
security,
guerre.
energy, and finance to
Madame la
reduce the impact of
Présidente,
the war. Madam President,
les allégations concernant des
allegations
violences,
concerning
notamment sexuelles, contre
violence,
les femmes,
especially sexual
sont
violence
un
against
sujet
women,
de très grande
are
préoccupation.
cause for grave,
Mon
very
pays
grave
est très
concern. My country
préoccupé
is
également
very concerned as
par
well
les attaques
at
contre les
attacks
infrastructures
against
et les personnels
infrastructure
humanitaires.
and humanitarian
Les
personnel.
travailleurs humanitaires qui s'activent sur les lieux de combat ne
Humanitarian
doivent
workers
jamais être
working
la
in
cible
theaters
d'attaques
of
armées.
conflict should never be the
Ces
target
derniers
of
sont
armed
bien souvent le
attacks.
lien qui
They are
maintient les
very
victimes
often
de
the
la guerre
link between
avec
victims
ce
of
qui
war
reste d'humanité lorsque
and
les
what
fondements
remains of
sont
humanity
renversés.
when the rug has been
Ces
pulled
derniers
from under
doivent
their
pouvoir
feet.
acheminer l'aide humanitaire
Humanitarian
dans tous
workers
les
should be
lieux
able to
où elle est
funnel
nécessaire,
humanitarian assistance
sans
to wherever
entrave
it is
et
needed
dans des
without
conditions de
obstacles
sécurité
and in conditions of
garanties
security
par toutes les parties.
guaranteed by all parties.
Des convois
It
d'évacuation
should be possible to form
sécurisés doivent
secure
pouvoir être
evacuation
édifiés
convoys
pour permettre
to
le bon
allow for
déroulement
the
des évacuations
smooth
des personnes qui souhaitent quitter les zones de
evacuations
combat.
of
Il
persons
s'agit d'une
wishing
aide
to
vitale
leave
pour
combat
les quelques
zones.
18
This
millions
is
de personnes ont
a
besoin
vital
d'aide
form of assistance
humanitaire en Ukraine.
to the almost
La
18
situation à
million people
Mariupol,
in need of
pour ne citer
humanitarian
que cette
assistance in
ville,
Ukraine.
devient proprement
Situation
intenable.
in Mariupol, to
La
mention just this
la
town, is
détérioration
becoming plainly
exponentielle des conditions de vie,
untenable. The
voire de survie
exponential
dans certaines
deterioration
localités,
in living
est
conditions,
très
indeed
préoccupante.
survival conditions in
Plus
certain
encore,
places,
lorsque
is
les
very concerning,
infrastructures civiles
especially
et
when
la fourniture
civilian
de services
infrastructure
publics
and the provision of
indispensables sont
essential
touchées.
public
Nous
services
sommes
are
préoccupés par les risques
affected.
de maladies
We
résultant
are
de pénuries
concerned at the risks
d'eau
of
dans
disease
certaines
resulting
localités
from
du pays,
water
mais
shortages in
aussi des
certain
risques
parts of
sanitaires
Ukraine, but
découlant du
also
manque d'accès
health
à des
risks
soins de
ensuing
santé
from the lack of
primaires ou
access to primary or
spécialisés.
specialized healthcare.
Les femmes,
Women,
les enfants, les
children,
personnes âgées
the
et
elderly,
tous ceux
and
qui ne prennent pas
anyone
part aux hostilités
not taking
doivent
part in
pouvoir être
hostilities should
secourus
be able to
à
be
tous les points de
rescued in
vue sans
every sense
craindre
of the
pour leur
word
vie.
without fearing for their
Madame la
lives.
Présidente,
Madam President,
la guerre est une horreur,
war is
une
a
rupture
horror,
à tout point de
a
vue
break
avec ce qui, en
with
tant qu'humains, nous
that
lie
which
les uns
binds
aux
us
autres.
together as humans.
C'est pour tenter de
It is
réduire les
precisely
effets de
to
cette
seek
rupture
to
que le droit
reduce the effects of this
international
break
humanitaire
that
existe,
international humanitarian law
pour ne pas laisser
exists,
libre
to
cours à
not give
l'expression de la
free
force.
rein to the expression
En
of
fait, pour
might
suppléer
is right. In
au
fact,
moyen du droit
it is an
à
attempt
la
to
rupture
address
du
through
contrat
law
humain.
a break in the
Toutes
human
les parties
contract.
doivent le
All
respecter.
parties should abide by
Concernant les
international
informations
humanitarian law. Concerning
persistantes
the
faisant
persistent
état de
reports
massacres,
of massacres,
d'exécutions sommaires,
summary executions,
d'atrocités
atrocities, and
et autres
other
crimes de
mass
masse
crimes
visant les civils
against
à Butcha,
civilians in Bucha,
il est urgent qu'une
there
enquête
is an
libre et
urgent need
indépendante
for
sous
a
la houlette des Nations
UN-led,
Unies soit
free and
commanditée dans les
independent
meilleurs délais
inquiry
pour faire toute la lumière
into,
sur les victimes et sur
as
les
soon as possible,
circonstances de
to
ces
shed
exactions.
light on the victims and the
Dans l'intervalle, il est
circumstances
primordial
surrounding
que ce
these
Conseil ne
atrocities.
perde pas
In
de
the
vue son
interim,
rôle,
it is vital that this
celui de
council not
travailler à
lose
ramener la
sight of
paix et
its
la
role,
sécurité
which is
en
to
offrant une
work towards
alternative à
restoring
la
peace
guerre.
and security by offering an
Le
alternative
retour à
to
la paix
war.
en
The
Ukraine
return
ne se fera
to
pas
peace
par
in
des échanges
Ukraine will
d'invectives.
not be achieved
Madame la
through
Présidente,
mudslinging.
cette guerre a
Madam
assez
President,
duré
this war
et
has
ses effets
lasted
se
long
font
enough and
déjà
its effects are
sentir
already being
au-delà des
felt
frontières de l'Ukraine.
beyond Ukraine's
De notre
borders.
point de vue,
From our perspective,
l'équation se pose en
the
termes de
equation is
décision
posed
sur
in
la mise en
terms of
place
a
d'un
decision
cessez-le-feu
on
et sur la
establishing a
création des
ceasefire
conditions
and
d'un
on creating
déploiement
the
sûr et
conditions for
sans entrave de
safe
l'aide
and
humanitaire
unfettered
nécessaire aux
provision
populations
of
qui sont dans la
humanitarian
détresse.
assistance needed
Je
by
voudrais réitérer
populations in
l'appréciation de
distress.
mon pays en
I wish
direction
to
des pays
reiterate
voisins de
Gabon's
l'Ukraine
appreciation
qui continuent de se
to
mobiliser pour l'accueil
neighboring
d'urgence
countries that
des
continue to
réfugiés.
mobilize to
Nous les encourageons à
urgently
accorder le
welcome
même accueil
refugees.
à
We
toutes les
encourage
personnes
them
en
to
détresse,
extend the
sans
same
distinction
welcome
d'origine
to all
ou
persons
de
in
race,
distress
y
without
compris les
distinction as to
ressortissants et
origin or
étudiants
race,
africains.
including
Nous
African
demandons le respect de
nationals
leur
and
dignité
students.
et appelons
We
à un
request
traitement équitable
them to
de toutes
ensure
les personnes
respect
en
for their
détresse.
dignity, and we call for
Il
fair
est urgent
treatment
que les
of
parties
all persons
s'engagent
in distress.
résolument
It is
dans
urgent that the
temps de la
parties commit
négociation
resolutely
en vue d'un arrêt des hostilités.
to
Nous appelons pour
negotiation
cela à
to
la
bring an end to the
désescalade
hostilities. We
et à l'arrêt
call
des combats.
to a
Il n'y a pas
de-escalation
d'autre
and
issue
a
possible.
halt to the
Mon
combat.
pays est attentif
There is no other way.
aux
My
négociations
country
qui se
is
poursuivent actuellement
closely
entre les
following
parties,
current
notamment à
negotiations between
Istanbul,
the parties,
et espère qu'elles
especially in
aboutiront à
Istanbul,
court terme
and we hope that they will soon lead to a ceasefire so as to create a climate of confidence and to establish the climate of calm needed for diplomacy to make its voice heard and for the guns to be silenced. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Gabon for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Благодарю вас, госпожа председатель.
Thank you, Madam
Хотели бы прежде
President.
всего выразить признательность и
I'd like to, first of
благодарность
all,
делегации Объединенных
express
Арабских Эмиратов за
gratitude to the
председательство.
delegation of the United Arab
в
Emirates
марте.
for their presidency in the
Благодарим
month of
генерального
March.
секретаря
We're also
ООН
grateful to the
Розмари
Secretary
Ди Карло и
General,
Мартину
to Rosemary
Гриффитсу
DiCarlo
за
and Martin
брифинги.
Griffith for their
Выслушали
briefings.
президента
We
Украины
also
Володимира
listened to the
Зеленского.
President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelenskiy.
Хотим поблагодарить Мартина
We'd like to
Гриффитса за
thank
его визит
Martin
в
for
Москву,
his
в
visit to
ходе
Moscow,
которого, насколько мы можем
during
судить,
which, as far as we can
у него
judge,
состоялись полезные
he had
встречи.
some useful meetings and
Ему
discussions.
лучше, чем кому то ни было известно,
Better than anyone
какие
else, he
усилия
should
Россия
know
каждый
the
день
efforts
прилагает
that Russia is
для
undertaking every
организации
single day to
гуманитарных
organize humanitarian
Однако
corridors.
свои обязательства даже в
However,
рамках
the
достигнутых с помощью
arrangements
международных
reached with the help of
посредников
international
целенаправленно
mediators
выполняет именно
is
украинская
consistently
сторона.
not being implemented by the Ukrainian side.
Я не буду вас
I'm
перегружать
not
цифрами.
going to
Подобные
overload you with
сводки
figures. You
ежедневно
can
публикует наше
such
Министерство обороны.
communiques are published every single day by our
Отмечу,
Ministry of
что
Defense. I
только
simply
из
would like to
Мариуполя
say
в
that just
восточном
out of
направлении,
Mariupol toward the
без
east,
какого-либо участия
without
украинской
any
стороны,
participation by the
нам
Ukrainian
удалось уже
side, we have
спасти
managed to save
123,5 тысячи человек.
123,500 people.
В общей же сложности с
Now,
начала
overall,
специальной
since the
военной операции в
beginning of
России
the special
эвакуировано
military
уже свыше
operation,
620
over
тысяч человек.
600,000 people have been
Более
evacuated to
121
Russia,
тысяч детей.
including over 119,000
И речь не
children.
идет о каком-либо
And we're not
принуждении
talking
или
about any kind of
похищении, как это
coercion
любят
or
представлять
abduction,
наши
as
западные
our
партнеры.
Western partners like
О
to
добровольном решении этих людей
present this,
свидетельствует
but rather
множество
of the voluntary decision
видеороликов,
by these
доступных в
people
социальных
is
сетях.
testified by many videos that are accessible in social media.
Господа председатели, сегодня была заявлена
Madam
другая тема
President,
встречи,
another
которая
topic of the
практически не
meeting
обсуждается,
was
поэтому я
declared today, which
опущу эту
is
часть и
practically not being
хочу
discussed today, so
воспользоваться
I'm going to leave
виртуальным
that out. I
участием в
simply
нашем
would like
заседании
to
президента
take
Украины
advantage
и
of the
обратиться
virtual presence
непосредственно к нему.
here of the President of Ukraine and would like to
Мы
address
оставляем
him
на вашей
directly.
совести бездоказательные и огульные обвинения
Now we place on
в
your
адрес российских
conscience
военнослужащих,
the
которые не подтверждаются никакими
ungrounded
свидетельствами очевидцев.
accusations against the
Об
Russian
этом вчера
military, which are
подробно
not
говорили
confirmed by
на пресс-конференции.
any eyewitnesses. And we spoke about this in detail yesterday at our press conference.
Владимир Александрович, мы все хорошо
Vladimir
помним, как в
Alexandrovich, we all
2019 году
remember
вы были
that when
избраны
in
президентом
2019
Украины.
you were elected as the
С
president of
вашим
Ukraine.
избранием было связано много
Now, there were a
надежд.
lot of hopes
Ведь вы шли
tied to
на
your
выборы
election
с
because
обещанием мира,
you
окончания войны в Донбассе.
were,
Вас поверило
as a
русскоязычное
candidate,
население,
pledged
права
peace
которого
and
вы
an end
обязались
to the
защищать.
war in Donbass, including the Russian-speaking population, which you pledged to protect.
Казалось, вот и та историческая несправедливость,
So it
когда
seemed
после
that we were
майданного переворота
on
в
the
2014
verge of
году
correcting
Украину
the
стали
historical
превращать
injustice when, as a
в
result of the
злобную
Maidan
антироссию идет в
coup
историю.
in 2014, Ukraine began to be transformed into a hateful anti-Russia, and that seemed to be on the verge of being turned, that page of being turned.
Но этим надеждам
However,
не суждено было сбыться.
those hopes failed to
И вот вы уже
to
презрительно называете
materialize, and
жителей
now you
Донецкой и Луганской
scornfully
народных
call the
республик особями,
the residents of Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic as a subspecies,
вторя вашему предшественнику, который грозил, что
repeating what
дети
your
дончан и
predecessor
луганчан будут гнить в
stated,
подвалах.
who in fact threatened that the residents of the Donetsk and Lugansk will rot in their basements.
Вы призываете их
And you
уезжать
are
в Россию.
calling on them to return, to leave
И
and
вот вы уже
to Russia.
ополчились на
And
родной
now
для
you've
вас
declared
русский язык,
war
вводя, по
against your
сути,
native Russian language
языковую
by
инквизицию в
introducing, in
стране, где
essence,
русский
a
является родным для
linguistic
как минимум
inquisition in a
40%
country where
населения.
Russian is the native language for a minimum of 40% of the
А
population.
сегодня взрывы и снаряды
Today,
звучат почти по всей
explosions and
территории, на
artillery
всей
rounds
территории
are
Украины, не
exploding
только на
over
востоке,
the entire territory of Ukraine, and
где
not
они не
only in the
смолкали
east,
8
where
лет.
they haven't ceased for the past 8
И
years.
звучат они именно потому,
And
что
they're
другого
exploding
способа
precisely
принести мир
because
в
there was no
Донбасс,
other
к
way of
сожалению, не
bringing peace to the Donbass,
После того,
unfortunately,
как вы и ваши
after
подчиненные
you and your
категорически
subordinates
отказались выполнять Минские
categorically
соглашения,
refused to comply with the Minsk
приготовившись при этом
agreements.
уже в
At the
марте
same
решить
time, by
проблему Донбасса
preparing
военным.
already back in March to solve the
В
problem of the
ходе
Donbass
нашей
by military
спецоперации
means.
мы
In the
нашли
course of our
множество
special
соответствующих
operations, we
секретных
have
приказов.
found many secret orders testifying to this.
Нам говорят, что на
We're
Украине
told
не
that
может
there
быть
can be no
нацистов.
Nazis in
Однако мы
Ukraine.
прекрасно
However,
знаем,
we
что
know
они у
very
нас не только
well
есть, но, к
that not only are
сожалению,
they
правят
there,
бал.
but unfortunately they are running the show.
Да и как может быть иначе,
And how
если
can it be
национальными
any
героями
other way
Украины
when the
являются
national heroes
нацистские
of Ukraine
пособники
are
Бандера и
Nazi
Шухевич, ответственные не
collaborators
только за
Bandera and
Холокост,
Shuhevich, who are
но и за
responsible not only
убийство
for the
сотен
Holocaust,
тысяч
but the
мирных
killing
поляков,
of
русских,
hundreds of
украинцев
thousands
и
of
евреев.
peaceful Poles, Russians, Ukrainians, and Jews.
Вы просто предпочли не
You
замечать
simply
украинских
preferred
неонацистов,
not to
делая вид,
notice
что их
Ukrainian
попросту нет.
Nazis, pretending
А
that
они,
they're
к
simply not
сожалению,
there.
есть,
But
и их
unfortunately,
еще
they
больше, к
are
сожалению,
there.
очень много, а среди
And
них много молодых.
they are very many of them, and among them a lot of young people.
Откуда мы это знаем? Да они
How
этого
do
не
we know that?
скрывают,
Well, they're
делают
not
нацистские
concealing it.
татуировки, украшают
They have
одежду
tattoos
свастиками
made,
и другими
Nazi
нацистскими
tattoos.
символами.
They decorate their
Приветствуют друг друга как
clothing with
нацисты, не
swastikas and
скрываются
other
в
Nazi symbols.
соцсетях.
They give Nazi greetings, and they're open about it in the social
Их
media.
особенно много в составе национальных
There are particularly
батальонов,
many of
таких
them
как
in the
Айдар, правый
national
сектор и Азов.
battalions such as Aidar, the right sector, and the Azov battalion.
И это было бы ладно,
And
но
that
они
would be
еще и
one
действуют
thing,
как
but
нацисты,
they're also
убивают как
acting
они.
like Nazis, and they're killing like them.
Причем не только пленных
And
российских
they're not
солдат,
just killing
мучениями которых потом похвалятся в
Russian
интернете,
or
но и
prisoner
своими.
soldiers, in which they torture and gloat
Наши
about it on the social
неонацисты,
media, but
радикалы
they kill
отличаются
their own.
беспримерной
Your
жестокостью к мирному
neo-Nazis and
населению,
radicals
которые они используют в
have
качестве
shown
живого
unrivaled
щита и
cruelty against the
устанавливают
civilians,
рядом с
which they
жилыми
use as
домами
human
тяжелую
shields,
артиллерию
and
и РСЗО.
position heavy artillery next to residential buildings and
Мы
multiple
сегодня
rocket
опять
launchers as
слышали
well.
огромное
Today
количество
we've
лжи
heard
о
once again a
российских
huge amount of
военнослужащих.
lies about Russian soldiers and military.
У нас есть сотни, если не
We have
тысячи,
hundreds, if
не
not
тысячи
thousands
видеосвидетельств людей,
of video
которые готовы
testimonials
дать
of people who are
показания
ready
о
to provide
жестокости
testimony about
украинских
the
националистов.
cruelty of Ukrainian
Зачитаю здесь
nationals. I'll
лишь
just
некоторые из них.
read some of them here.
Это жестокие истории, но вы должны их
These are
услышать.
cruel histories, but you need to hear them.
Наталья Кудинова,
Natalia
мэр
Kudinova
города,
says
сбежал одним
the
из
mayor
первых.
of the town
Затем
was one of the
украинская
first to
власть
run
врала,
away.
что
Afterwards,
Россия
the
не
Ukrainian
пропускает людей по
authorities
гуманитарным
lied that
коридорам.
Russia was not letting people through
Женщин с
humanitarian
детьми нас
corridors.
батальона Азов
The
под
National
страхом
Battalion
смерти удерживал
Azov,
в подвалах
under threat
и
of death,
грабил на
kept women and
блокпостах
children in
мирных жителей.
basements, and it robbed civilians at checkpoints.
Бабушка с внучками
My
рассказывала, как
grandmother
батальон Азов не давал выйти из подвала,
said that the Azov
и
battalion did
кто
not
сделал шаг
allow her
вперед,
to
стрелял на
leave
поражение.
basements. Anyone trying to leave
На
was shot
блокпосту Азова
at the Azov
девушек и
checkpoint.
женщин раздевали
Women and
догола, забирали золото и
girls were
деньги.
stripped naked and had their jewelry
Включая
and money
последнее.
taken away.
Валентина Николаевна Борисенкова рассказывает, как
Valentina
украинские военные
Nikolaevna
выгнали из
Borisenko
частного дома на улице Краматорской
says how
женщину с двумя
Ukrainian
детьми и стреляли
soldiers
оттуда из
kicked
миномета.
out
Она
women
со
with two
слезами на
children
глазах
from a
ушла,
private
выгнали
home
из
and then used
собственного
it
дома
to
ее.
lob mortar rounds.
Двое деток у нее.
And that
Выгнали
woman had
хлопцы,
two
повязки
children.
голубые у них.
They were
Это
kicked
украинские
out
опознавательные знаки.
by soldiers with blue armbands. Those are Ukrainian insignias.
Марина
Insignias of the
Васильевна
Ukrainian
рассказывала,
army.
как ее пытали в подвале СБУ в Краматорске. Пристегнули меня в
Testified that
канализационной
she was
трубе.
tortured in a
Когда
basement
узнали,
by
что я
Ukrainian
русский, били,
security
пытали
services.
электротоком,
They tied me
насиловали,
to a sewer
угрожали
pipe when I found out
привести
I was Russian. They
несовершеннолетнюю
beat
дочь
me,
с ней
used
сделать
electric
тоже.
current, raped me, and they threatened to rape
Шаповалова
my young
Ольга
daughter.
Георгиевна. Выехали из Мариуполя, из
Shapovalova
Мангуша уже
Olga
25
Georgievna.
марта.
We left Mariupol from Mangusha on the 25th of March.
Огневые точки ВСУ
Firing
стояли между
positions of the
домами и во
Ukrainian
дворах
army
школ,
were positioned between
прикрываясь мирными
residential
жителями.
homes and in the courtyard
По
of a school.
кварталу
They used
вокруг
civilians as
драмтеатра
cover.
ездил
In the
украинский танк и
neighborhood around the
производил
drama
беспорядочные
theater,
выстрелы.
a Ukrainian tank drove
Стрельба
around,
велась по
firing
жилым домам.
indiscriminately, including targeting
На территории
residential buildings.
69-й,
On the
68-й,
territory of the
5-й школы
69th,
стояли танки.
68th, and the 5th school,
Видела своими
tanks were
глазами.
stationed. I saw this with my own eyes.
Суппорткина Ольга
Madam
Сергеевна.
Supportkina Olga
Школа
Sergeyevna,
номер
this is her
15 мы
testimony.
выехали.
And school number
С
15 of
25 февраля
Mariupol,
ВСУ заняли
starting
там
from
свои позиции и
25th of
уехали
February,
оттуда 7
the
марта.
Ukrainian armed forces took up
Стрельбу оттуда
positions and left
производили.
on the 7th of
Наш
March.
дом
They
пострадал
directed
от
fire
обстрелов.
from there. Our building was badly
8
damaged from the
9 марта
shelling.
были
On the
очень
8th and
сильные
9th of
обстрелы,
March,
и именно
there were
целенаправленно было
intense
по домам.
shelling, intentionally targeting
Украинских военных спросили,
residential
зачем
homes.
они это делают.
Ukrainian soldiers were asked
Ответили,
why
что
they're
пока
doing it. They
весь русский дух
replied that
не
until they
уничтожат,
destroy the entire
будут
Russian
находиться там.
spirit in whole, they will
Мародерство с их
remain there.
стороны началось сразу.
They started looting
Разграбили все
immediately. They
магазины.
plundered all the shops.
Эвакуироваться нам помогли войска
And it was
ДНР, довезли нас
the
до
forces
Мангуша.
of the Donetsk People's Republic that helped evacuate us and
Есть еще
drove us
множество
to Mangusha.
душераздирающих
There are
историй.
many other
Есть до
heartrending
смерти замученные
stories.
русские и украинцы
There
с
are
выжженными свастиками на груди.
Russians and Ukrainians tortured to death
Есть
with
убитые мародерами и
swastikas burned into
преступниками,
their chests.
которым
There are
раздали оружие. Мирные граждане и
looters
иностранцы,
and
гибель которых руководство Украины,
criminals
вопреки фактам,
who
здравому смыслу,
you distributed
пытается свалить
weapons
на
to. They're civilians
российских военных.
and foreigners
Я говорил
who
об
are
этом,
held
еще раз
hostages.
скажу.
And in spite of all
Это
factual
подлость.
evidence and common
Это
sense, you're
подлость
trying to
думать о
lay
том,
the
что
blame for
российские
their death
военнослужащие
on the Russian
способны на
military.
то, чтобы
This
это сделать.
is absolutely unacceptable. And the fact that you even
А
consider that
теперь
Russian
еще есть ли откровенные
military would be
преступные
capable.
постановки с
And
мирными
now we're
украинцами,
seeing
убитыми своими
blatant
же
criminally
радикалами,
staged
с тем,
events
чтобы
with the
улучшить геббельсовские
Ukrainian
традиции, как великих
civilians who
смерти
were killed
российской
by their
армии.
own radicals in the best traditions of
Убиты в
Gabon
тех
to
районах, которые
accuse the
российские
Russian army.
войска оставили после
Those
обнадеживающих
killed in the
мирных,
areas from which the
многих
Russian
мирных
forces
переговоров
withdrew after
Стамбула.
encouraging peace negotiations in
То есть теперь
Istanbul.
выясняется, что зря
So now it
оставили, я
turns
говорю
out
прежде
that we
всего о
shouldn't
Буче.
have withdrawn. I'm talking about
Я
Bucha first and
понимаю,
foremost. I
вы
understand that
видели трупы,
you
слышали
were
рассказы. Вы
shown,
увидели
you
только то, что
saw
вам хотели
corpses and
показать.
heard testimonials,
Вы
but
не
you only
можете
saw
не
what
видеть
they showed you.
вопиющих
You
нестыковок
couldn't
в той
ignore the
версии
flagrant
событий,
inconsistencies in the
которые
version of
продвигают
events which are
украинские и
being
западные
promoted
СМИ.
by Ukrainian and Western media.
И то, что трупов в
The
городе
fact
не
that
было
the
сразу после
corpses
ухода
were not
российских
there
войск,
right after
о
the
чем
withdrawal of
свидетельствует
our
сразу
Russian
несколько
forces, which is
видеосъемок.
confirmed by
И
several
то, что есть
videos, and the fact
записи,
that there are
где украинские
recordings
радикалы
where
призывают
Ukrainian
стрелять по тем, у
radicals
кого
urged
белые
shooting
повязки,
at
то
those
есть
with
по
white
мирным гражданам.
armbands, in other words,
Если вы
against
смотрели
civilians.
внимательно видео, которое
If you
сегодня
saw
мы
the
показывали,
video
вы
very
бы
carefully
заметили,
that
что на
was
тех
shown
людях,
today, you'll see that
которые
those
лежат на
people
земле,
who are on
есть
the
белые
ground
повязки,
have
это мирные граждане.
white armbands. These are civilians.
И то, что трупы на видео
And the
никак не
fact that the
похожи на те, которые
corpses on the
пролежали на
video in
улице
no way
3-4 дня.
resemble those that could have been lying on the
А
street
по
for 3 or 4
сенсационным и
days.
абсолютно
And
антинаучным
based on
данным
the
Нью-Йорк Таймс,
sensational and
вообще с
completely
20 марта.
scientifically absurd information of the New York Times, they were there since the
Повестись на этот
20th of
фейк могут
March.
либо абсолютные
So
дилетанты, либо
the only
наши
ones who could
западные
fall for
партнеры,
this
которые
fake
ничего
are
не
absolute
хотят слушать и
dilettantes,
давно
our
уже называют
Western
черно-белым
partners who
наоборот.
don't want to hear anything and have been calling black, white, and vice versa
К
for a long time
сожалению,
now.
этим странам на саму Украину
Unfortunately,
наплевать. Она
these
для
countries
них
don't
была
give
и
a
есть
hoot
всего лишь
about
пешка в
Ukraine itself.
геополитической игре против
It's
России,
simply a pawn
которой они
in the
легко
geopolitical
пожертвуют.
game against Russia,
Но
which
пока
they will
постараются
sacrifice
продлить
easily.
этот
But in the
конфликт,
meantime, they will
поставляя
try to
туда
prolong
побольше
the
оружия и
conflict
боеприпасов.
by delivering as
Но
much
самое
weapons as
главное,
possible
повторю
and
еще
ammunition.
раз,
But the most important
как мы
thing is that
докатились до той
how have
жестокости,
we
которую
sunk to
проявляют
such depths of
националисты,
cruelty
например, за
that
Азов.
nationalists are
А
displaying,
вы,
for example, those
в
from the
данном
Azov
случае
battalion.
обращаюсь к
And
президенту
you,
Украины, в интервью
I'm
американским СМИ стыдливо
addressing the
защищаете,
Ukrainian
говоря,
president.
что они такие, как
In
есть.
your interview with the Americans media, you coyly,
Хочу,
bashfully
чтобы вы
state that they
задумались,
are
и
what
очень
they are.
надеюсь, что вы
I
найдете
really hope that
решение
you will reflect
этой ситуации,
on this and
потому что
hope
оно
that you will
зависит
find a solution to the
только от
situation
вас.
because it depends
Потому что вы
only on you.
пришли к
Because
вам не из-за
we
украинских
came
земель.
to you, to
Вы
Ukraine,
пришли,
not to
чтобы принести
conquer lands.
долгожданный мир на
We came to
истекавшую
bring the
кровью Донбасс.
long-awaited peace to the
Не
blood-soaked
перемирие,
land of Donbass.
а именно
Not a
настоящий
truce,
прочный мир.
but a
А для
true
этого надо
lasting
искоренить
peace.
ту
And for this, we
жестокость, о
need to
которой
root
говорю,
out the cruelty, which I
вырезать ту
mentioned.
нацистскую
We
раковую
need to
опухоль,
cut out the
которая, пожирая
malignant
Украину, со
Nazi
временем
tumor
начала бы
that is
пожирать и
consuming
Россию.
Ukraine and would in
И
time
мы
begin to
добьемся
consume
этой цели,
Russia. And
надеюсь,
we will achieve that
скорее,
goal.
чем позже.
I hope
Другого
sooner
выхода
rather than
быть не
later,
может.
because there is no
Мы
other
не бьем
outcome.
по гражданским
We are
объектам,
not
чтобы сберечь
shooting
как можно
against
больше мирных жителей,
civilian targets in order to save as
Потому
many
и
civilians as possible. This
продвигаемся
is
не так
precisely
быстро,
why
как многие
we're not
ожидают.
advancing as fast
Мы
as
не
many
действуем так,
expected.
как американцы и их
We're not
союзники
acting like
действовали в Ираке и
Americans and their
Сирии,
allies in Iraq
стиравшие
and
с лица
Syria,
земли целые города.
razing entire cities
Им
to
их
the
было не
ground.
жалко.
They
А
had
нам
no
жалко,
pity
потому
for
что
them,
это
but we
близкие
felt
нам
great
люди.
pity because these are people who are close to us.
Вот радикалам, правда, нечего терять. Им
Radicals have
наплевать на
nothing to
мирных жителей.
lose. They
Они
couldn't care
готовы
less
тянуть за
about
свою могилу
civilians. They're
хоть
ready
все
to take
население
to the grave
Украины,
with
как
them
это
the
четко
entire
показала
population of the
провокация
Ukraine,
Бучи.
as was clearly demonstrated by the
Не дайте
provocation in
Западу
Bucha.
реализовать
Don't
свои планы,
allow the
Владимир
West to
Александрович.
achieve its goals, Vladimir
Примите
Alexandrovich.
правильные решения,
Make the
необходимые
right
для вашей
decisions that
страны,
are needed for
потому что
your
Запад
country,
готов
because the
сражаться
West is
на
ready
Украине до
to
последнего
fight
украинца.
in the Ukraine
Примите
until
это
the last
решение сейчас.
Ukrainian. Make that
Ведь
decision
реальную
now,
ситуацию на фронте
because
вы
the real,
прекрасно знаете.
you know the real
Потом
situation on the
может
front.
быть поздно. Благодарю.
Later, it might be too late soon. Thank you very much for your attention.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ireland.
Thank you very much, Madam President. And I'd also like to thank the Secretary General and our other briefers this morning. I want to express a very warm welcome to President Zelensky being with us this morning. President Zelensky, your courage, your leadership, and the courage of the Ukrainian people are an example to all of us. Secretary General, on the 24th of February, as Russia launched a large-scale invasion of its neighbor Ukraine, you told the world that Russia's action was wrong, that it was against the Charter, that it was unacceptable. We agreed with you. However, you also told us that this invasion was reversible and called on President Putin to end this war to save innocent lives. We echoed those calls. Sadly, 40 days later, our call has been left unanswered. Instead, over the last 40 days, we have witnessed unprecedented levels of destruction and human suffering. We are watching cities pounded by Russian artillery. We are seeing millions forced to flee their homes, seeking refuge from Russian aggression. Just minutes ago, here in this chamber, we have seen the utterly shocking images of civilians lying dead in the streets of Bucha and elsewhere in Ukraine. Some, we know, are piled into improvised mass graves. Simply harrowing. So many innocent lives lost on our watch as our pleas for peace go unheeded. The attempts here today to deny Russian culpability are frankly appalling in their cynicism, and I see them as an insult to the memory of those slaughtered civilians. Madam President, we roundly condemn the atrocities reportedly committed by the Russian armed forces in a number of occupied Ukrainian towns. The images from Bucha and other towns in the Kyiv region liberated by Ukrainian forces are horrifying. We here cannot suspend our humanity. Our thoughts, first and foremost, must be with the families of those killed. Their pain at the loss of their loved ones in such an unspeakable manner is almost unimaginable. Let's be clear. The Russian authorities are responsible for these atrocities committed while they had effective control of the area. The Russian authorities are subject to the international law of occupation. There can never be impunity from such crimes. Never, ever. Not in Bucha, not in any other town or village, ever. Where crimes have been committed, they must be fully investigated and evidence preserved so that these crimes can be prosecuted by domestic and international courts, including the International Criminal Court. Ireland will continue to support efforts to ensure robust and independent investigation of all violations of international law. We must have accountability and justice for the victims and for the survivors of this war. We at this table share that responsibility in face of such atrocity. We call on the Russian Federation to abide by the order of the International Court of Justice and to immediately cease its military action and withdraw from the entire territory of Ukraine. Madam President, in the last 40 days, we have seen a horrific humanitarian disaster unfold in Ukraine because of the Russian Federation's unprovoked and unjustifiable further invasion of that country. a country where just weeks ago, citizens lived in relative peace and prosperity, and one which has been transformed now into one where families lack access to basic necessities, where basements have become bomb shelters, where millions have become IDPs and refugees. The use of explosive weapons in populated areas has had a devastating impact on civilians in the midst of active hostilities. Once again, we call for the parties to the conflict to comply with international humanitarian law, including the obligation to direct attacks only against military objectives, the prohibitions against indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks, and the obligation to take all feasible precautions in attack. We have heard increasing allegations of sexual violence by Russian soldiers. You referred to this morning, Secretary General. We must stress that conflict-related sexual violence can constitute a war crime. The perpetrators of such crimes must be accountable. They must be held accountable. They will be held accountable. Sexual violence is another abhorrent crime of this war that cannot go unanswered. We again reiterate the need for full, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access to those in need, as called for today by Martin Griffiths. Secretary General, we again echo your call for Russia to implement an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. It is the very least the aggressor can do. It is way past time. As we know, the reverberations of this war are reaching far beyond Ukraine. It's unacceptable that Russia's war of choice against Ukraine is also having and will continue to have significant spillover effects across the globe. Deterioration of food security, surging energy prices, increasing poverty. The most vulnerable and impoverished in developing countries will suffer the most. We utterly reject that. Madam President, it is our collective responsibility here at this table to maintain international peace and security, nothing less. This is why we call on the Russian Federation to stop this war, to stop its unlawful attempts to establish occupying authorities, to stop destabilizing the democratic foundations of the Ukrainian state. Such steps are yet further reprehensible violations of Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. It gets harder each time to say this, but it is never too late to do the right thing and to end this war now. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Ireland for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me start by thanking Ambassador Nusseibeh, along with her team at the UAE mission, for competently navigating the work of the Security Council in March. I welcome His Excellency, Mr. Volodymyr Zelenskiy, President of Ukraine, in the Council today. I would like to thank the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, and the Secretary General for Political Affairs, Rosemary DiCarlo, and Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Martin Griffiths, for their updated presentations about the situation in Ukraine. Madam President, as we enter into the 6th week of hostilities in the Ukrainian territory, we continue to witness appalling images of human suffering. The recent reports of acts of violence against civilians in Bucha, Irpin, Kharkiv, Donetsk, and other places affected by the conflict are extremely worrying, according to the statement by the ICRC. We call for a really independent and thorough investigation of all reported violations with the full cooperation of both parties to the conflict without prejudging any conclusions, and underscore the need for perpetrators to be held accountable. The international community is witnessing for too long appalling scenes of destruction of once peaceful cities, with shocking images from the conflict and the desperation of thousands of civilians trapped in the battlefield, with no food, no water, and no electricity. Once again, we renew our pleas for a broad, effective, and immediate cessation of hostilities in Ukraine. Only after the silence of the guns and the withdrawal of troops are achieved will it be possible to halt the immense costs of human suffering this conflict has brought. Madam President, the General Assembly has recently adopted a resolution on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. As we said on that occasion, the General Assembly could not become a bystander of the shocking consequences of the conflict. And as we added last week in this chamber, neither can the Security Council. As the main UN organ with primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, the Security Council has the mandate and the responsibility to address this situation in an effective manner. Nevertheless, our assessment is that the Security Council is failing in its role to help in supporting efforts to foster a constructive dialogue between the parties, with the aim of brokering an effective peace settlement to this conflict. We deeply regret that the Security Council has not been able to speak with one voice throughout the crisis. Promoting compliance with international humanitarian law, protecting civilians, calling for peace. These are objectives that should unite rather than divide us. We should strive to create the conditions for, on the one hand, invigorating the political negotiations, and on the other, reaching an understanding on practical measures to minimize human suffering in Ukraine. Civilians wishing to flee the hostilities must be able to do so in safety, and those who decide to stay cannot become targets of attacks. In the same vein, parties must grant safe passage to relief consignments to those in need. Once again, Brazil reiterates the call for all parties to fully respect and ensure respect for international humanitarian law. The causes of conflict, whatever they are, do not undermine the obligations of all parties have to guarantee that civilians should be protected, that the wounded receive medical care, that humanitarian assistance reach those in need, and that detainees be treated humanely in all circumstances. There must be no politicization of humanitarian actions, nor selective application of international humanitarian law. Also, geopolitical objectives must not supersede the endeavor for peace, nor prolong the human suffering caused by war. Madam President, this conflict and its associated sanctions, apart from the enormous human suffering and devastation caused in Ukraine, is having spillover effects in the entire world, especially through increased prices of oil, gas, grains, and fertilizers, among others. Food insecurity has become an even greater threat to the world's poorest people, above all in developing countries. The longer this conflict persists, the higher the risk of further instability, hunger, and devastation in Ukraine and around the world. It is high time to return to the path of dialogue and diplomacy for a peaceful settlement of the conflict. We urgently need the cessation of hostilities. De-escalation of tensions and negotiations are the only way out of this conflict, not only for the countries directly involved, but also for the entire world. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Brazil for his remarks, and I now give the floor to the representative of Kenya.
Thank you, Madam President. I congratulate you on assuming the presidency of the Security Council for April and assure you of my delegation's full support. I listened closely to the remarks by the Secretary General and his Undersecretaries General, Rosemary DiCarlo and Martin Griffiths, hoping to hear that our fears that the war in Ukraine has entered a new, more dangerous phase were exaggerated. Sadly, they offered no such comfort. Instead, we are left with the words of His Excellency Volodymyr Zelenskiy, the President of Ukraine, who has described the horrifying suffering of civilians in Bucha and other towns and neighborhoods in Ukraine. His account of the atrocities is in stark contrast to that of our colleague in the Security Council, the representative of the Russian Federation. But the fact that the truth in Bucha is contested is the surest sign that we stand on the precipice of more widespread abuses of human rights. In April 1994, even as genocide engulfed Rwanda, there were members of the Security Council contesting the horrifying truth that 1 million people were being murdered. We should stand warned that the inability of the Council to establish the facts and accordingly attribute responsibility may enable the risk of escalation into far worse crimes. Beyond the city of Bucha, Madam President, we're extremely worried about the safety of civilians who are trapped in other besieged cities and villages, such as Mariupol and Kherson. Our actions today should seek to prevent what we have witnessed happen in Bucha take place in Mariupol and Kherson. While we debate who is responsible for the horrors of Bucha, it is incontestable that what started as a special military operation is now a war, and that what began with reassurances of limited aims, not targeted at civilians, has led to thousands of dead civilians and millions of refugees and internally displaced. No one can doubt that there are flagrant violations of international law, international humanitarian law, and the UN Charter underway in Ukraine. Kenya condemns the abuses undertaken in the past few weeks and those in the eastern provinces of the country during the years that the conflict has raged. Madam President, the war in Ukraine is today's most dangerous threat to the maintenance of international peace and security. It is the latest assault by the most powerful states against the multilateral order. Their continued abuse of the Charter created growing cracks over the years in the global security order. Now the bottom has fallen out. Ukraine may now become a model for a new generation of disastrous wars on multiple continents. Millions of refugees are being created, and there will be many more as the economic effects of the war produce and intensify conflicts elsewhere. Accelerating food and energy prices are plunging millions into worse forms of poverty. The UN, as a forum for solutions to humanity's most pressing problems, is losing prestige and its historical standing. President Zelensky has left us with ideas for Security Council reform that we need to consider seriously. Things have fallen apart, and the center cannot hold under these assaults on our United Nations. We must reform. There are no easy solutions. Even a negotiation that is not properly structured to protect the people and sovereignty of Ukraine could be the prelude to a wider war. For now, we urge the following urgent steps, understanding their limits due to the continued inability of the Security Council to act decisively. We call for an impartial and prompt United Nations investigation into the atrocities against the civilians in Bucha and other towns in Ukraine. This calls for an immediate end of all hostilities to guarantee unfettered access by the investigating teams. We urge the conflicting parties to immediately make clear to their military personnel that they will be held to account on the basis of command or superior responsibility if they violate the international laws that regulate warfare. We commend Ukraine's neighbors for opening their borders to refugees of multiple nationalities from Ukraine. We continue to urge them to ensure that the thousands of affected Africans be treated conflict in Ukraine. We reiterate our call for the cessation of hostilities to allow humanitarian operations under clearly defined contact lines and humanitarian passages. Madam President, I finish by reaffirming Kenya's recognition of the inviolable rights of Ukraine to its sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Kenya for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Señora Presidenta,
President,
le deseamos éxito durante su presidencia este mes y reconocemos el trabajo de Emiratos Árabes Unidos en la conducción del Consejo de Seguridad el mes pasado. Agradecemos las presentaciones del secretario general y de los subsecretarios Carlos y Griffith, y reconocemos la participación del presidente Volodymyr Zelenskiy en esta sesión del Consejo de Seguridad. Le hemos escuchado con la mayor atención y con el respeto que nos merece su investidura. También hemos visto con horror las imágenes que nos ha compartido. Son el mural de Guernica, recreado una vez más con víctimas civiles. Desde hace 6 semanas, el mundo sigue con consternación las consecuencias devastadoras de la invasión de Rusia sobre Ucrania. A través de 2 resoluciones de la Asamblea General, la comunidad internacional se ha pronunciado de manera contundente, deplorando dicha invasión, exigiendo el cese inmediato de las hostilidades y de cualquier ataque contra la población civil o la infraestructura de carácter civil, y ha señalado la urgencia de que llegue la asistencia humanitaria de forma expedita, segura e irrestricta. La Corte Internacional de Justicia exigió también la suspensión inmediata de las operaciones militares en territorio de Ucrania. Toca a las Naciones Unidas actuar como garante del cumplimiento de las decisiones de la Corte. Todos los mecanismos de solución pacífica de las controversias que establece el derecho internacional deben canalizarse hacia ese objetivo común. Lamentablemente, las hostilidades continúan y las afectaciones civiles aumentan, y junto con ellas aumentan las necesidades humanitarias de la población, incluidas cada vez con mayor urgencia la de los refugiados y los desplazados internos. Las imágenes de las calles en Bucha y en otras ciudades que han circulado profusamente en los últimos días han conmocionado al mundo. Condenamos de manera enérgica las atrocidades
que en
the
ellas se
atrocities
reflejan,
captured in those
no hay
images,
absolutamente
there is
nada
absolutely
que las
nothing
justifique.
that can justify them.
Proteger a la población civil
Protecting the
es
civilian
una
population
responsabilidad
is
irrenunciable
an
de la
undeniable
comunidad
responsibility
internacional.
borne by the international community.
Como lo ha señalado la alta
As
comisionada
the
para
High
los Derechos
Commissioner for
Humanos,
Human Rights pointed
las
out,
graves violaciones al derecho internacional humanitario
gross
y al derecho
international
internacional de los derechos
humanitarian and
humanos
international
obligan
human
a
rights
mantener
law
la
violations
posibilidad de
compel
que
us
efectivamente
to consider the
se haya
possibility that
incurrido
war
en
crimes
crímenes
may
de guerra.
indeed have been committed.
México respalda
Mexico
cabalmente la
stands
declaración del secretario
strongly
general
and resolutely by
para que
the
se
Secretary
realicen a la
General's
brevedad
statement calling for
investigaciones
prompt,
imparciales que permitan
impartial
identificar responsables
investigations leading to
y una
the
eficaz
identification of
rendición de
perpetrators
cuentas.
and effective accountability for them.
Igualmente, seguimos con atención el
By the
trabajo de
same
la Corte
token, we will be
Penal
closely following the work
Internacional
of the International
y
Criminal Court,
apoyamos al fiscal
and we
que
support
se
the
encuentra en proceso
prosecutor
de investigar
who is
supuestos
now in the
crímenes
process of
internacionales
investigating
cometidos en
allegations of
Ucrania,
international crimes committed
así
in
como a la
Ukraine,
Comisión de
as
Investigación
well as
Independiente
the
creado
independent
con esos mismos
international commission of
propósitos por el
inquiry
Consejo de
established for
Derechos
the same
Humanos
person
de la
by
ONU.
the United
Sus
Nations
informes serán
Human Rights Council,
determinantes.
and their
Las
reports will be
consecuencias de esta guerra
decisive.
han sido
The
terribles.
consequences of this war have
Su
been
impacto dramático
horrifying.
tendrá también efectos
Its
graves en el
tragic
mediano y el largo
impact
plazo,
will
no solo en la
produce
región,
serious
sino en todo el
effects
resto del
in
mundo.
the medium and long term, not
Como lo
only
ha
in the
dicho
region,
con
but throughout
claridad
the
el
rest of the world,
director
as
ejecutivo
was
del Programa
clearly
Mundial de
stated by the
Alimentos,
Executive Director of the World Food
millones
Program.
de personas
Millions of
pagarán en
people
carne propia
will
el precio de
pay
este conflicto. Habrá
themselves the
escasez
toll
de alimentos
in
básicos
this
en muchas
conflict.
regiones
Supplies of basic food
que
items
ya de por
will
sí
run short in many
eran
regions where
inseguras
they
y
are
frágiles.
already insecure and
Con
fragile.
todas las dificultades
Now,
que implican
given
y la
all the
urgencia que conllevan,
difficulties
los esfuerzos de la
that
comunidad
this
internacional para hacer
implies
frente al drama
and the
humanitario
urgency
son
ensuing,
solamente
the efforts of
temporales.
the international
La
community to
solución de
tackle
fondo
the humanitarian
es,
tragedy are
como aquí
only
se ha dicho,
temporary.
un
The solution,
cese
as it has
inmediato
been
de las
said,
hostilidades
is an
y un acuerdo
immediate end to
político
the
que restaure la
hostilities and
negociación
a
por
political
la vía
agreement that
diplomática.
restores
Apoyamos
diplomatic
decididamente las
negotiations.
gestiones del
We are
subsecretario Griffiths para
resolutely in
acordar
support
pausas
of
humanitarias
Undersecretary
que
General
permitan crear las
Griffith's
condiciones en
initiatives
el
to
terreno
broker humanitarian
para que llegue
pauses
con mayor
to
fluidez
pave the way
la asistencia
for
humanitaria.
smoother delivery of humanitarian
México
assistance.
reconoce y
Mexico
encomia el trabajo de
appreciates
todos los
and
actores
commends the work
humanitarios
of
involucrados en
all
Ucrania,
humanitarian actors
así como la
involved in
solidaridad
Ukraine,
de los países
as well as
vecinos
the
que han
solidarity
recibido a
of neighboring
millones de
countries that have
refugiados
received
y
millions
los
of
esfuerzos de
refugees
mediación
and the
de
mediation
distintos países
efforts of
y diferentes
various
actores. Esperamos
actors
que
and
este
countries.
Consejo,
It is our
con
hope
apego
that this
estricto
council
al derecho
will
internacional,
fulfill its
al derecho
responsibility to
internacional
contribute
humanitario
effectively
y al
to
derecho
putting an end
internacional de los
to the
derechos
war and
humanos,
restoring peace,
cumpla con
and
su
to do so
responsabilidad
in
y
strict compliance
contribuya
with international
efectivamente
law
a
and
poner fin a la
international
guerra y a restaurar
humanitarian
la
law,
paz.
and
Gracias,
put an end
Presidenta.
to war and restore peace. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Mexico for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of India.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me begin by thanking Secretary General Antonio Guterres for his presence and remarks on the situation in Ukraine. I also thank USG Rosemary DiCarlo and USD Martin Griffiths for their respective briefings on the security and humanitarian situation. We thank the participation of His Excellency, the President of Ukraine, at today's meeting. I also take this opportunity to thank the United Arab Emirates and Ambassador Lana Nusayba for their excellent presidency. Madam President, the situation in Ukraine has not shown any significant improvement since the Council last discussed the issue. The security situation has only deteriorated, as well as its humanitarian consequences. Recent reports of civilian killings in Bushehr are deeply disturbing. We unequivocally condemn these killings and support the call for an independent investigation. We hope the international community will continue to respond positively to the humanitarian needs. We support calls urging for guarantees of safe passage to deliver essential humanitarian and medical supplies. Keeping in view the dire humanitarian situation in Ukraine, India has been sending humanitarian supplies to Ukraine and its neighbors, which include medicines and other essential relief material. We stand ready to provide more medical supplies to Ukraine in the coming days. India continues to remain deeply concerned at the worsening situation and reiterates its call for immediate cessation of violence and end to hostilities. We have emphasized right from the beginning of the conflict the need to pursue the path of diplomacy and dialogue. When innocent human lives are at stake, diplomacy must prevail as the only viable option. In this context, we take note of the ongoing efforts, including the meetings held recently between the parties. The impact of the crisis is being felt beyond the region, with increasing food and energy costs, especially for many developing countries. It is in our collective interest to work constructively, both inside the United Nations and outside, towards seeking an early resolution to the conflict. Allow me to reiterate the importance of UN guiding principles of humanitarian assistance once again. Humanitarian action must always be guided by the principles of humanitarian assistance, which is humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. These measures should never be politicized. We continue to emphasize to all member states of the UN that the global order is anchored on international law, UN Charter, and respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty of states. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of India for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I first of all would like to congratulate you upon assuming the presidency of the Council for this month. At the same time, I would also like to thank Ambassador Zelenskiy as well as the UAE team for their outstanding work when UAE was the president of the Council during the month of March. Madam President, de-escalating tension in Ukraine and putting an early end to the fighting is the urgent expectation of the international community and the strong desire of China. We have many times emphasized that dialogue and negotiation is the only way out for opening a door of peace. Russia and Ukraine have already had many rounds of negotiations. We welcome the two sides to stick to the general direction of peace negotiations, overcome difficulties and differences, and continue to build conditions for a comprehensive settlement of the crisis. The international community should create favorable conditions and environment for negotiations between the two sides, open up space for political settlement, and should not set up roadblocks to increase resistance for peace, let alone add fuel to the fire to aggravate confrontations. Every effort should be made to prevent the escalation of the localized conflict. China attaches great importance to the humanitarian issue in Ukraine and supports all initiatives and measures conducive to alleviate the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. As the current conflict continues, we call on the parties to abide by international humanitarian law, protect the safety of civilians and civilian facilities, minimize civilian casualties, and ensure safe and smooth evacuation and access of humanitarian corridors, as well as guarantee the basic rights of women, children, and wounded fighters. Humanitarian issues should not be politicized. The humanitarian needs of Ukraine and its neighboring countries are enormous. International humanitarian agencies should maintain neutral and impartial should maintain neutrality and impartiality, actively mobilize and coordinate more resources, and make unremitting efforts to save lives and protect civilians. China has provided and will continue to provide humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. and its neighboring countries. Under international law, civilians should be spared of any forms of violence in armed conflict, and attacks against civilians are unacceptable and should not occur. The reports and images of civilian deaths in Bucha are very disturbing, and the relevant circumstances and specific causes of the incident must be verified and established. Any and all accusations should be based on facts. Before conclusions are drawn, parties should exercise restraint and avoid unfounded accusations. Madam President, as pointed out by Secretary General Guterres, the spillover effects of the Ukrainian crisis is having a major impact on the world and the developing countries in particular. This requires our great attention and our strengthened management. Sanctions are not an effective means to solve the problem, but will instead accelerate the spillover of the crisis and bring new and complex problems. Today, with the deep development of globalization and the closely linked community of mankind, the implementation of all-dimensional and indiscriminate sanctions is tantamount to politicizing, instrumentalizing, and weaponizing the world economy, triggering serious crises in the fields of global economy and trade, finance, energy, food, industrial chain, and supply chain, and endangering decades of development gains of the international community and making people of all countries pay a hefty price. The vast number of developing countries are not parties to the conflict and should not be involved in this confrontation, let alone be forced to bear the consequences of geopolitical conflicts and great power competition. The world's major economies should be responsible for managing the risk of crisis spillover and maintaining the stability of global markets and the momentum of the global economic recovery. Madam President, more than 30 years after the end of the Cold War, such a geopolitical tragedy taking place in Europe now deserves our profound reflection. The sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries should be respected, and small and medium-sized countries should not be pushed to the forefront of confrontation between and among great powers. All countries have the right to decide their foreign policy independently and should not be forced to take sides. The security of all countries is inseparable, and the security of one country cannot be achieved at the expense of the security of others. We call upon the United States, NATO, and the European Union to engage in comprehensive dialogues with Russia, to face head-on their differences accumulated over the years, find solutions to the problem, and promote the building of a balanced, effective, and sustainable regional security framework. On the issue of Ukraine, China does not seek geopolitical self-interest. It is not our mindset to watch the situation indifferently from the sideline, let alone do anything to add fuel to the fire. There's only one goal we sincerely look forward to, and that is peace. China will continue to promote peace talks and play a constructive and responsible role in helping resolve the crisis in Ukraine. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Madame la Présidente, je salue la participation du président Zelensky à cette réunion et à travers lui le courage et l'esprit de résistance du peuple ukrainien. La France se tient à vos côtés. Je remercie le secrétaire général, la secrétaire générale adjointe aux affaires politiques et le secrétaire général adjoint aux affaires humanitaires de leurs interventions. La guerre d'agression que la Russie livre contre l'Ukraine a franchi ces derniers jours un nouveau cap dans l'horreur. Des images de charniers, d'exactions de masse contre des civils dans les localités du nord de l'Ukraine, à Butcha, à Borodianka,
Borodianka
Motyine
and Motyine
ont suscité la condamnation et
have
l'indignation partout dans le monde.
led to the condemnation and
Nous exprimons toute
indignation
notre
around the
compassion
world. We like to
pour
express
les victimes,
our
toute notre
wholehearted compassion
solidarité
for
avec
victims
les
and our
Ukrainiens
full
et restons bien
solidarity with the
entendu sous le choc
Ukrainians.
des images
And we're
effroyables
still shocked
qui viennent d'être
by the
diffusées dans la
horrific
vidéo
images that
plus tôt ce matin.
were shown in the video this morning.
La France condamne avec la
France
plus grande
condemns in
fermeté
the strongest
les
terms
exactions massives
the
commises par
massive
les forces
atrocities
russes.
committed by the
Ces
Russian
exactions pourraient
forces.
être
These
constitutives de crimes de guerre,
atrocities could
mais
constitute
aussi de
war
crimes
crimes,
contre
but also
l'humanité.
crimes against humanity.
Les manœuvres de désinformation
The
utilisées par la Russie
disinformation
pour
tactics
dissimuler
used
ces
by
crimes
Russia
ne
to
surprennent
conceal its
malheureusement
crimes,
personne.
unfortunately, are no surprise to
Une fois
anyone.
encore, Moscou ajoute à
Once again,
l'indignité du
Moscow,
meurtre de civils
to
et du
the
massacre d'enfants,
disgrace of
celle du
the murder of
mensonge,
civilians
du
and
cynisme
children, is
et du
adding the
négationnisme.
disgrace of
Madame la Présidente,
lying
face à ces
and
crimes
denial.
odieux,
Madam President,
la
in the
France
face of
appelle à ne
these
pas
horrific
céder à la
crimes,
haine et
France
appelle à agir
urges not giving
autour de
into
plusieurs
hatred and
axes.
rather to take
Premièrement, il nous
action
faut
along
maintenir
the following
une
lines.
pression
First of all,
la
we
plus
need to
forte possible
maintain
pour
the strongest
contraindre les
possible
autorités
pressure
russes à
to
mettre
compel
fin
the
à
Russian
une guerre qui
authorities to
ébranle
put
la
an end
sécurité
to a
mondiale,
war that is
comme cela a
compromising
été
global
discuté
security
bien au-delà de l'Europe, notamment
and
la sécurité
well
alimentaire.
beyond Europe, including
La
food
France reste
security.
totalement engagée pour y contribuer, notamment
France
avec
is
ses
fully
partenaires
engaged to
européens,
contribute to this, in
dans le cadre de
particular
la
with
présidence
its
française du
European
Conseil de l'Union
partners, in the
européenne
framework
ainsi
of
que
the
dans le
French
G7.
presidency of the
Elle
European
poursuivra aussi son appui déterminé
Council
aux
and the
autorités
G7.
ukrainiennes sous
It will
toutes ses formes.
continue its determined support to the
Deuxièmement,
Ukrainian
les crimes
authorities in all
commis en
possible
Ukraine ne doivent pas
forms.
rester
Secondly,
impunis.
the crimes
Des
committed in
enquêtes
Ukraine should not remain
crédibles,
unpunished.
indépendantes,
Credible,
doivent être
independent
menées afin de permettre aux juridictions
inquiries should be
nationales
conducted to allow
et
national and
internationales
international
compétentes de
jurisdictions
juger les
that
responsables de ces
have
atrocités.
competence to judge the
Nous
perpetrators
appelons en
of these
particulier la
atrocities. In
Russie comme
particular, we
l'Ukraine
call on
à
Russia
coopérer
as well
pleinement
as
avec la
Ukraine
Cour
to
pénale
fully
internationale
cooperate with the
et avec la
International
commission
Criminal
d'enquête
Court
établie par
and
le
with
Conseil
the
de l'Europe.
Commission of Inquiry set up by the Human
Madame la
Rights
Présidente, la
Council.
Russie
Madam President,
poursuit avec
Russia
détermination et avec méthode
is
sa guerre en
pursuing
Ukraine,
methodically and
avec
with
son lot de
determination
destruction
its
et de
war of
souffrance
Ukraine with its
indescriptibles.
share of destruction and
Nous
tragedy.
appelons au respect du droit
We
international
call for the
humanitaire.
respect of
Les
international
civils,
humanitarian
y
law.
compris les enfants
Civilians,
et les
including
personnels
children
humanitaires,
and
doivent être
humanitarian
protégés.
personnel, must be
Il en est de même
protected.
pour les
The
infrastructures
same
civiles,
goes for
notamment les
civilian
hôpitaux, les
infrastructure, in
écoles.
particular
Nous
hospitals and
saluons la
schools.
mobilisation des pays frontaliers de
We
l'Ukraine,
welcome the
qui jouent
mobilization
un
of
rôle
the
absolument majeur dans
countries
l'accueil des
neighboring
réfugiés.
Ukraine who are playing a major role
L'hospitalité dont ils font preuve,
in
c'est
receiving
honneur à l'Europe.
refugees. The hospitality that they've
L'Union
demonstrated is a
européenne a
credit
notamment
to
mobilisé
Europe.
un
The
paquet
European
de plus
Union
de
has in
500
particular
millions d'euros de
mobilized a
soutien
package of
d'urgence
over
à l'Ukraine.
500 million
Et le Conseil
euros of
européen des 24
urgent
et
support
25
to the
mars
Ukraine, and the
dernier
European
a également
Council that took
prévu la
place
mise
on
en
the
place d'un fonds
24th and
fiduciaire de
25th of March
solidarité
also
avec
is
l'Ukraine.
planning to set up
La France prend également sa part avec 100 millions
a
d'euros d'aide
trust fund of
humanitaire.
solidarity for the Ukraine.
Nous
France has
soutenons les
also
efforts du
contributed
secrétaire
100
général et
million
de
of
Martin
humanitarian
Griffiths pour
assistance. We
obtenir un
support the efforts
cessez-le-feu
of the Secretary
humanitaire pour
General
permettre
Martin
l'évacuation des
Griffith
civils
to achieve
de
a
toutes les villes
humanitarian
assiégées et
ceasefire
l'accès
to
de l'aide
allow the
humanitaire.
evacuation of civilians from besieged
Tous les
cities
efforts
and
doivent
to
être
ensure
faits en vue
access
de
to
parvenir à
humanitarian
la
assistance.
cessation
All
des
efforts should
hostilités.
be made in
C'est
order
une
to
première étape
achieve a cessation of
indispensable vers un règlement
hostilities. This is
durable du
an
conflit.
initial
C'est un signal
stage
nécessaire à
towards
la
a lasting
crédibilité de
solution of the
l'engagement russe
conflict,
dans
and it's
toutes les
necessary
négociations.
for the credibility
La France est
of the
déterminée à continuer à
Russian
contribuer aux efforts de
involvement
paix,
in negotiations.
notamment en
France
soutenant
is
les autorités
determined to continue
ukrainiennes
to
dans la
contribute to
recherche d'un
efforts of
règlement
peace, in
politique
particular
une fois
by
qu'un
supporting
cessez-le-feu aura
Ukrainian
été mis en
authorities
place,
in seeking a
ainsi bien sûr
political
que par le maintien de
solution
canaux
once
de
the
dialogue
ceasefire
avec
is
la Russie.
achieved, as well as by maintaining
Madame la
channels
Présidente,
of dialogue with
comme
Russia.
l'a rappelé
Madam President,
le 3
as
avril le ministre français de l'Europe
the
et des
French
Affaires
Minister
étrangères,
of
M.
Europe
Le
and
Drian,
Foreign Affairs
la France reste
recalled on the
totalement
3rd of
engagée pour
April,
mettre fin à cette guerre
France
d'agression
is fully
dont le
engaged
coût humain, dont l'impact
in
humanitaire
putting an end to this war of aggression,
Face à l'horreur et face à la
of which the
dévastation
human cost and
de l'agression
humanitarian
russe,
impact
la
is
France
increasing
réaffirme
by
sa
the day. In the
solidarité
face
pour
of the
soutien à l'Ukraine
horror of the
et
Russian
aux
aggression,
Ukrainiens.
France
Et
reaffirms its
nous appelons le
solidarity
peuple
and
russe,
support
qui est
for the
également
Ukraine and
victime dans
Ukrainian
cette guerre,
people. We also
à
call on the Russian
continuer de
people who are
trouver les
also
moyens
victims in this
d'exprimer
war to
son
continue to
opposition à
find
ce
ways of
conflit,
expressing their
en
opposition
dépit
to
de la
this conflict,
répression.
in spite of the
C'est
repression.
nécessaire pour rompre avec
This
la
is
logique de
necessary
haine
to break the
dans
logic
laquelle
of
Vladimir
hatred
Poutine veut
in
enfermer
which
les
Vladimir
Ukrainiens
Putin
et les
wants to
Russes.
imprison both
Je vous
Ukrainians and
remercie.
Russians. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of France for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Norway.
Thank you, President. I thank the briefers for the valuable inputs. Norway also expressed its utmost support to you, Secretary General, to make full use of your good offices in search for a peaceful solution. I want to thank President Zelensky, through you, Ambassador, for his strong testimony this morning and for the heroic fight the President, the Ukrainian government, and the Ukrainian people are engaged in for your country and for the peace and freedom of us all. We are with you and we support you. As we heard from President Zelensky and have seen this weekend, the need for peace could not be more urgent. For more than 40 days and nights, attacks from Russia have continued to batter the Ukrainian people and their cities, causing death and destruction. And the suffering is escalating. We too are appalled by the reports coming out of the areas around Kyiv and other regions. We are deeply shocked by the atrocities committed against civilians in places that has been held by the Russian forces, including Bucha. The images are distressing: dead bodies on the roads and in mass graves, homes, schools, hospitals, and other civilian infrastructure destroyed and reportedly left mined. President, Russia is desperate to hide the truth about the war, but atrocities must be investigated and those responsible must be brought to justice. In this respect, we welcome the establishment by the Human Rights Council of a commission of inquiry on Ukraine to investigate all alleged violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law. And we also welcome that the ICC has opened an investigation into the situation in Ukraine. We urge Russia and everyone holding evidence to fully cooperate with these investigations. We cannot allow there to be impunity for war crimes being committed in Ukraine. The world is watching. President, Russia's unprovoked and illegal war against Ukraine, a free and sovereign country, is also an attack on democratic values and on freedom. It is a blatant violation of international law and the very principles of the UN Charter. And as the Secretary General underlined this morning, this Council has a responsibility. We must do everything in our power to end the war and to mitigate its impact. Let me repeat the message by the Norwegian Prime Minister Støre gave to President Putin when they spoke on Thursday. He urged him to cease the hostilities and emphasized that Russia must ensure rapid, safe, and unimpeded humanitarian access to the civilian population, particularly in Mariupol. He stressed also the need to find a negotiated solution to end the war. President, the suffering is widespread. Russia's war is causing the largest humanitarian crisis in Europe since the Second World War. A quarter of the Ukrainian population has now been displaced, and cluster munition will continue to maim and kill long after the conflict has ended. The reconstruction, when it comes, will take years. Ukraine has been set back decades in its economic development, and the consequences of this war will be felt by generations of Ukrainians. Russia's war is also being felt globally, exacerbating other humanitarian crises and causing a serious negative effect on the agricultural sector with a global rise in food insecurity and increased prices of fuel and fertilizers. President, before concluding, let me be very clear. Russia must abide by international law. It must comply with the order of the International Court of Justice to immediately suspend this military operation and to withdraw its troops from Ukraine. The killing and destruction must end. Russia must stop its illegal war. Thank you.
Representative of Norway for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I congratulate the UAE for its successful presidency in the preceding month and wish you and the UK delegation the very best for this month. Let me begin by thanking the Secretary General for his statement to the Council and welcoming the briefings of USG Rosemary DiCarlo and USG and Emergency Relief Coordinator Martin Griffiths on the prevailing situation in Ukraine and the coordinated humanitarian response of the United Nations agencies in the face of difficult operational challenges on the ground. I also welcome the virtual participation in this meeting of the President of Ukraine, His Excellency, Mr. Volodymyr Zelenskiy. My delegation has taken careful note of the Ukrainian President's remark, noted his country's steadfast commitment to peace, and encouraged the path of dialogue and diplomacy in finding a settlement of this needless war. Madam President, the prolongation of the war in Ukraine continues to be a situation of deep concern for Ghana. We are particularly disturbed by the increasing humanitarian costs arising from the unjustified aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine. We have observed with pain the unbridled bombardment of civilian populated areas, as well as civilian and other critical infrastructure, without regard to the customary norms of international law and the principles of international humanitarian law relating to armed conflict. Ghana is gravely concerned by the reports of alleged gross violations of international humanitarian law and international criminal law since the onset of the invasion, including emerging reports and images of human rights violations and the killings of civilians in Mariupol, Chernihiv, Kharkiv, and areas on the outskirts of Kyiv, such as Bucha. We support the call by the Secretary General for an independent, impartial, and thorough investigations to establish the facts, gather the evidence, and to hold all perpetrators of such atrocious crimes accountable for their actions. The killing of children, the aged, medical personnel, humanitarian workers, and journalists are deplorable, and we condemn all such acts unreservedly. We urge restraint on all sides and re-emphasize the urgency of an unconditional cessation of hostilities nationwide to enable the evacuation and safe passage of civilians and facilitate the delivery of life-saving aid to the people in the cities that remain under siege. Humanitarian agencies require unobstructed access to reach people in need of food, water, and medicine and other critical supplies, and all parties must guarantee such access. The ravages of both the global COVID-19 pandemic and the situation in Ukraine demonstrates the interconnectedness and interdependence of states and reinforce the need for a unified international response in support of the path of dialogue and diplomacy. Madam President, we have followed closely the direct negotiations between the conflicting parties and note the progress made in the fourth round of consultations which took place in Istanbul on 29th of March 2022. To sustain the negotiations, we urge a restraint in the ongoing hostilities and a follow-through of the express commitments to resolve the security concerns of the parties. In furtherance of the efforts of the parties, the Council must at this time focus attention on supporting confidence-building measures that facilitate a negotiated settlement of the immediate conflict and the wider question of European security on the basis of international law and other internationally agreed frameworks. The convergence of the parties and the international community on these matters will be the only way to end the tensions, bridge the differences between the parties, and forge a unified position on the situation in Ukraine. I thank you for your kind attention.
I thank the representative of Ghana for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Thank you, Madam President, and I'd like to join others in congratulating you and your team for assuming the presidency and wishing you a productive month. I'd also like to thank the Secretary General, the Undersecretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, and the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and the Emergency Relief Coordinator for their helpful briefings. We also thank President Zelensky for his address to this Council. We have once again heard in this Council deeply sobering and concerning reports from the ground, including from Martin Griffiths and Rosemary DiCarlo. And with every meeting, the Council is reminded of the rapidly deteriorating humanitarian situation on the ground in Ukraine. 1/4 of the country's population have fled their homes. And the rising death toll and the destruction of critical civilian infrastructure are a grim reflection of the tragic human cost of war. The images coming out of Bucha and other towns and cities are shocking. The alleged crimes they entail are of the utmost gravity. And first and foremost, as others have said, we must establish what has happened here with the cooperation of all parties. It is imperative that we do not get caught up in a war of narratives in addition to the conflict that is ongoing. Indeed, we need to allow for the existing mechanisms to investigate the facts on the ground impartially so that justice for all victims can be served, and we acknowledge the Secretary General's call for that independent investigation, as well as last week's appointment of the members of the Human Rights Council's Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine. As we enter the 6th week of conflict, we believe that an immediate cessation of hostilities throughout Ukraine is imperative to move towards a peaceful solution to the war in Ukraine. And we take note of efforts to reach a diplomatic resolution to the conflict, and we see the ongoing negotiations and several rounds of negotiations between Russia and Ukraine as a very positive development. We remain hopeful that these efforts at the negotiating table can urgently translate into de-escalation on the ground, and we urge others to support these efforts. We also welcome the readout from Mr. Griffiths on his meetings with senior Russian officials, as well as his upcoming meetings with Ukrainian officials. Establishing a viable humanitarian ceasefire could be a stepping stone for broader negotiations and eventually a sustainable peace. However, until a cessation of hostilities is achieved, the priority must be to work towards protecting and alleviating the suffering of civilians. And in addition to the points we made during the last Council meeting on Ukraine on 29th March, I want to focus here on 4 additional points for the Council's consideration. First, as others have done, we all need to continue to reaffirm the need for all parties to abide by their obligations under international humanitarian law, in particular the protection of civilians and the respect for the principles of distinction and proportionality that are paramount in conflict. Second, the difficulties in providing relief and humanitarian access need to be addressed immediately and can be addressed quickly. It's critical to find either local or broad-based agreements for security guarantees to allow for the safe provision of humanitarian assistance and for civilians to voluntarily evacuate safely. And these are initial confidence-building measures that can be developed down the line and should also be encouraged, including the proposals left by Mr. Griffiths with the government in Moscow. Third, as the ICRC has noted, false narratives and disinformation has the potential to cause real harm for humanitarian organizations on the ground. The use of digital technologies that amplify the spread of harmful information, including misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech, is a true challenge in conflict zones. And these phenomena are not new, but technology has greatly increased the scale and speed at which harmful information reaches target audiences online. And this is particularly concerning in crisis settings where information can influence the dynamics and behavior on the ground and can put communities and humanitarian responders at risk. Fourth, at a time of conflict, protecting civilians, of course, must be our top priority. However, we should not forget the impact that war has on a nation's cultural heritage and identity. We're concerned by UNESCO's recent reports on the dozens of cultural sites that have been damaged in Ukraine since the conflict began. We know from our experience in the Middle East that protection of cultural sites is critical to rebuilding peace. And in moments of violence and turmoil, cultural sites are essential cornerstones for collective memory and a foundation for future reconciliation. We therefore call on all parties to refrain from the unlawful destruction of cultural heritage and to think about what comes next after the war concludes for the people living there and how they go about building peace. Before I end, allow me to take a moment to reflect on what others have commented on, including the Secretary General, and that is the devastating impact of the conflict on food security worldwide. And we're alarmed by these figures shared by the Secretary General just now on how the war is affecting some of the most vulnerable communities around the world. 1.2 billion people in 47 developing countries are at risk due to rising food prices. And food shortages are aggravating situations already on this Council's agenda. And these shortages are felt in other settings where high prices of basic commodities can lead to further unrest and instability, not just in this part of the world, but around the globe. So we look forward to seeing the UN Global Crisis Response Group on Food, Energy and Finance address these issues and offer it our full support. And let us not forget that the effects of this war are hitting communities that are still reeling from the global COVID-19 pandemic. And these vulnerabilities are further exacerbated by reduced domestic food production due to the rising costs and scarcity of chemical fertilizers and pesticides. And the knock-on effects, including global conflicts, will be grave, and the Council must stay focused on all of them. Unless we do something to end this conflict now, it will continue to drive suffering and instability worldwide in the coming months and years, and the world simply cannot afford this. And the Security Council should do its part to stop this conflict and to help parties come and reach a peaceful solution. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for her statement. And I will now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the United Kingdom. President Zelensky, by video, Secretary General, colleagues, the United Nations was created in the wake of a European war of aggression that laid waste to Europe and engulfed the world. All of us who signed the UN Charter committed to ending the scourge of war, to fundamental human rights, the dignity and worth of the human person, the equal rights of nations large and small, to justice and respect for international law. Yet now we're facing another war of aggression in Europe. We've heard today, again, the devastating impact of Russia's unilateral and illegal military action in Ukraine, its impact on surrounding countries and the region, and on the security and prosperity of the wider world as it seeks to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. Thousands killed, millions displaced, cities razed to the ground, hospitals bombed, citizens cut off from food, water, and medicine, blockaded seaports, and the rapid increase in wheat prices, pressure on already stretched humanitarian resources. And now, as Russia is forced into retreat from areas around Kyiv, the brutality of the invasion is laid bare. We've all seen the horrific images from the towns of Bucha and Irpin of civilians deliberately killed in areas from which Russian forces have recently withdrawn. And the video we saw earlier underlined that horror. These acts and other credible incidents must be investigated as war crimes, and the UK fully supports the work of the International Criminal Court and the work of the Ukrainian Prosecutor General and other national prosecutors. Colleagues, as we and so many others have said so many times, all of this could be stopped if the Russian Federation ended this war now. I resume my function as President of the Council. The representative of the Russian Federation has asked for the floor to make a further statement.
Thank you, Madam President. I know that this does not bring us closer to the end of today's meeting, but since today's topic is extremely important, I think it's essential to say a few words about what was the reason for this meeting, which we didn't have a chance to say yesterday because we were not given a chance to have a separate meeting of the Security Council on this topic. And unfortunately, yesterday's meeting, in any way possible, our Western colleagues tried to kind of sweep it under the carpet, and we have seen an example of how of the new rules-based order.
The rules-based order.
I would like to once again focus on the events in Bucha, which became the premise for conducting today's meeting and led to some far-reaching conclusions that many of you have already made.
Все подразделения вооруженных сил
All
России
units of the Russian
полностью
armed
вышли из
forces
Бучи в
fully
качестве
withdrew from
жеста доброй
Bucha
воли
as a
30
gesture of good
марта.
faith on the 30th of March.
На следующий день после очного раунда
The very
переговоров
next
России и Украины в
day
Турции.
after a round of negotiations between Russia and Ukraine in Turkey, in the
Сообщение
presence of
об этом
negotiators.
было в тот же день
Now,
опубликовано на
a report
официальных
about this
страницах
was
Министерства
published
обороны
that
России.
very same day on the official website of the Russian
За время
Defense
нахождения
Ministry.
города под
During
контролем
the
российских
time
войск
that
ни
the
один
town was
мирный
under the control
местный
of the
житель не
Russian armed forces,
пострадал
not
от
a
каких-либо
single
насильственных действий.
civilian suffered from any kind of violence.
Люди свободно передвигались по
People
городу
were able to
и
move around
пользовались
freely
сотовой
around the
связью.
town and use their cell phones.
Более того, населенные пункты Киевской области
The
российскими
towns of the
военнослужащими было
Kiev
расставлено и
Oblast
выдано мирным
was
жителям
the
452 тонны
the
гуманитарной
Russian
помощи.
army
Этому есть
supplied
подтверждающие свидетельства.
450 tons of humanitarian assistance to those cities. This was
Выезды из
confirmed.
города не блокировались.
Now, the towns, the Russian army did not prevent people from leaving the towns.
Все жители могли свободно
All
выехать в
inhabitants could
северном
freely leave
направлении.
the towns toward the north.
При этом южные
At the
окраины
same
Бучи,
time,
включая жилые кварталы,
the southern areas of Bucha, including residential
обстреливались
areas,
украинскими войсками
were shelled round the clock
крупнокалиберной
by
артиллерии,
Ukrainian
танков и
forces
РСЗО.
from using heavy caliber weapons, tanks, and mortars.
Уже после вывода российских сил
Already after
из
the
города,
withdrawal
мэр
of the
города Бучи
Russian
Анатолий
forces,
Федорук
the mayor of Bucha,
в
Anatoly
своем
Fedoruk, in
видеообращении
his
31
video
марта
statement on the 31st of March,
представил это как
presented
героическое
this as a
освобождение города украинскими
heroic
вооруженными силами.
liberation of the city by the Ukrainian armed forces.
Оставим на его совести лукавство в обстоятельствах так называемого
Now,
освобождения.
let's set aside its so-called liberation
Сконцентрируемся на
and
том,
let's
что он
focus
подтвердил
on
сам
the
факт.
fact that he
Уже
confirmed the fact
31 марта в
on
городе
the
никого из
31st of
российских
March that
военных не
there
было.
were no more Russian soldiers in the town on the 31st
Более
of
того,
March.
мэр не
Furthermore,
упомянул о
the
каких-либо
mayor did
расстрелянных
not
на улицах
mention
местных жителях со
any
связанными руками.
local inhabitants with their hands tied and
Вы можете
having been
поверить в
shot.
то, что мэр не заметил
I mean, could you
на
believe that the
улицах,
mayor would not have
как
noticed
сообщают,
on the streets
280 тел погибших.
as reported of 280 corpses?
1
wouldn't have
апреля
noticed that?
депутат
On the
Совета
1st of
Бучи
April,
Екатерина
the deputy of the
Украинцева
council, Ekaterina Ukraintseva, the
в
deputy of the
двухминутном
council of
ролике
Bucha, in a
неоднократно
2-minute
предупреждает
video,
односельчан,
warned several times the
что в поселение
local
зашли
residents
представители
that representatives
службы безопасности
of the
Украины
Ukrainian security
и
forces have
проводят
entered the
зачистку.
town and are conducting a
Просит быть
mop-up operation.
максимально осторожным.
And she's asking everyone to be very careful.
В сети в широком доступе имеется также
Now,
почти
on social
8-минутное
media, you can also find an almost
видео
8-minute
об
video
анонсированной украинцами
about
зачистке Бучи
the
национальной
announced
полиции Украины 2
mop-up
апреля.
of Bucha by the Ukrainian National Police on the 2nd of
На нем
April.
тел гражданских лиц на улицах
On
нет.
that video, there are no bodies of
Более
civilians on
того,
the
на этом
streets.
видео Нацгвардия Украины
Furthermore,
берет
on that
интервью
video,
местных
the
жителей,
National Guard of
которые также не
Ukraine
упоминают ни тел, ни
also
массовых
interviews
расстрелов.
local residents who didn't mention any corpses or
На одном из
mass shootings.
украинских новостных
On
сайтов
one of
было
the
также
Ukrainian
размещено
news sites, there
предупреждение
was also a
о
warning posted
предстоящей 2
on
апреля зачистке Бучи
upcoming
от российских
mop-up of
сообщников.
Bucha on the 2nd of April from a mop-up of Russian collaborators.
Сейчас оно удалено,
Now that's been
но
deleted, but
пользователям удалось его сохранить.
users were able to save that video.
Свидетельства, так
Now,
называемые свидетельства
so-called
преступлений
testimony of crimes,
российских вооруженных
evidence of
сил в
crimes
Буче
by
появились
the
только
Russian armed
3
forces in
апреля, на
Bucha
4-й день
appeared only on
в
the
город
3rd of
прибыли
April, on the
украинские войска.
4th day after the Russian forces left the town.
В очередной раз, без
Once
доказательств, а
again,
лишь на
without
основании
any
презумпции
evidence,
виновности,
based on the presumption of guilt,
российским военным пытаются вменить некие злодеяния.
the Russian army is being accused of some kind
Мы,
of evil
конечно же, не
deeds.
могли не заметить, с
Of
какой
course,
скоростью
we-
кадры украинских журналистов подхватили западные политики и известные
we could
правозащитные
not notice
организации,
how these
претендующие на
Ukrainian videos
беспристрастность и
were taken up by
непредвзятость.
Western media and human rights organizations
При этом
who claim to be
очевидные нестыковки,
impartial.
продвигаемые Украиной и
Clear
западниками
clear
версии событий
inconsistency
демонстративно
between
игнорируются.
between the Ukrainian version and
Ведь
the
если
actual
бы тела
facts is clear.
людей
If the corpses
действительно пролежали под
of
открытым небом
civilians
несколько дней, то на
had
них, несомненно, были бы
been out in the
соответствующие
open several
проявления
days,
хорошо известных
they would have had several signs that were well known to forensic specialists.
Это наших западных коллег, похоже,
And our
совсем не
Western
смущает.
colleagues don't seem to be bothered by that.
Иначе бы Нью-Йорк Таймс не
Otherwise,
пошла
the New
еще
York
дальше,
Times would not
утверждая,
even go
что
further
трупы
by
на улицах
stating that
пролежали
the
аж с
corpses
20 марта.
were there on the streets since the 20th
Вы
of
можете
March.
представить, в каком
Can you
состоянии
imagine
тогда
what
были?
kind of state they would have been in?
Кроме того, многие
Furthermore,
погибшие на
many
распространенных украинцами
of
кадрах имели на руках
those of
опознавательный
the
знак, белую
bodies
ленту.
in the videos circulated by the Ukraine had white bands, armbands.
Такую же, как надевали мирные жители
These
после прихода российских
are
военных.
armbands that were worn by civilians after the entry of the
А
Russian
на
armed
одном из
forces into the
выложенных
town.
украинскими радикалами в сеть видеороликов
And one of the
хорошо слышен
videos
призыв
posted by
стрелять по
Ukrainian
всем, у кого
radicals,
нет синих ленточек на
you could
рукавах.
hear a call to shoot anyone who doesn't have blue arm bands.
Это видео хода зачистки в Буче выложил в сеть один из лидеров так называемых территориальных батальонов, которым украинская власть бесконтрольно раздавала оружие.
Was posted by a member of the territorial
Кроме того,
defense
уже
battalion to
упомянутый
whom
мной
the
депутат
Ukrainian
городского
authorities handed
совета
out weapons.
Бучи
Furthermore, the member of the city
Катерина
council of Bucha,
Украинцева
who I
в
mentioned,
интервью
Ekaterina
«Медузе»,
Ukraintseva,
российскому новостному изданию «Медузе», призналась,
stated on
что
the
российские войска при ней людей не расстреливали.
website Medusa that she did not see Russian forces
В том же
execute
интервью она
any civilians. In the
подтверждает, что в
same
основных
interview,
разрушениях
she
виноваты украинские военные.
confirms that it's Ukrainian armed forces that are
Эти
guilty of most of the
моменты, разумеется, также
violations. Of
остаются
course,
за скобками в подаче наших украинских и западных
these
коллег.
are details that have not been mentioned in the presentations of our Western and Ukrainian colleagues.
Зато президент Зеленский уже
However,
рассуждает о том,
Ukrainian
что все
President
эти явно
Zelensky is
постановочные кадры из Бучи
already
якобы дают
claiming that
украинцам моральное право
all
на,
these
я
staged
цитирую,
events in Bucha
нецивилизованный ответ.
have give the Ukrainians the right for an uncivilized response.
Ну, что это такое, мы можем только догадываться,
we can
потому
just
как вели
imagine
себя
what that
украинские
is
радикалы на востоке Украины.
Based on how Ukrainian radicals behaved in the east of
Многочисленные
Ukraine.
свидетельства их преступлений
Many testimonials of
шокируют.
their crimes are shocking.
К сожалению, похоже,
Unfortunately,
на этом киевские специалисты по дезинформации и постановкам останавливаться не
Ukrainian
собираются.
experts on disinformation and staging do not intend to stop
Как
there.
заявили в Министерстве обороны
As
России, по
the Ministry
подтвержденной
of
информации,
Defense
вечером
claimed,
4 апреля
based
в
on confirmed
населенном
information in the evening of the 4th of April in the town of Moshun,
в 23 километрах
23
северо-западнее Киева,
kilometers to the northwest of
военнослужащие
Kiev,
72-го украинского
troops
главного
from the
центра
72nd
психологических
Ukrainian
операций
main center of psychological
была
operations
проведена очередная постановочная
conducted
съемка
another
якобы погибших от
staged
насильственных действий российских
staged
вооруженных
video
сил мирных жителей.
of so-called killing by Russian troops
Для
of
последующего
civilians
распространения через западные СМИ.
for future circulation by
Подобные
Western media.
мероприятия
These
украинскими
kinds
спецслужбами были
of
проведены также в Сумах и
activities
некоторых других городах.
have been carried out by in Suma and other
В
towns.
завершение
So
хотел
in
бы обратиться к
conclusion,
нашим
I would like
западным
to
коллегам. Мы
address
прекрасно
my Western
понимаем, что
colleagues.
вы
We
делаете,
understand
разыгрывая
very well
украинскую карту и с каждым днем
that
нагнетая истерическую
what you're
антироссийскую
doing
пропагандистскую кампанию.
by fueling anti-Russian hysteria
Поэтому мы
every single day.
предполагаем,
So
что будут и дальше
we are
происходить
assuming
новые
that there will
мерзкие
be
провокации по типу Бучи.
further horrible provocations similar to the one in Bucha.
Новые попытки очернить российских солдат, представить их
To
садистами, убийцами
discredit
и насильниками.
Russian soldiers and to present them as murderers and rapists.
Я уже говорил, что это крайняя
I
подлость.
said once again that this is an incredibly low blow.
Правда, вас не интересует то, что сегодня современные технологии позволяют сделать любое видео. Мы сегодня посмотрели видео, которое нам представила украинская сторона. Сейчас уже интернет полон опровержений того, что мы там видели, что это было снято не там, не в то время,
In fact,
и не с теми людьми.
information refuting what was in the video, stating that it wasn't
Последнее.
filmed in the right place with not the right people. And just a few words to my American colleague who declared a crusade to exclude Russia from the Human Rights Council. This is stated by the representative of a country who 3 years ago criticized the council in the strongest, harshest terms that it
осудить методы и действия американских солдат в Афганистане и Ираке.
That it had the audacity of condemning the actions of American soldiers in Afghanistan.
И как известно, Соединенные Штаты вышли
из случая. As is well known, the United States left the council.
Надеюсь, что наши коллеги по Организации Объединенных Наций не дадут себя собой манипулировать и не станут подыгрывать Вашингтону
manipulated and play up to Washington and its very dangerous games. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement. The representative of Ukraine has asked for the floor to make a further statement.
Well, thank you, Madam President. Before I switch to English, I would say a couple of lines rather, in Russian. Мы уже привыкли к вранью, которое постоянно выливается нам на головы в зале Совета Безопасности. Товарищ Небензя удосужился процитировать интервью из ресурса, который называется «Медуза». Хотелось бы спросить у товарища Небензя, а почему же он не цитирует его полностью? Разрешите мне зацитировать это интервью, которое представитель Путина хотел использовать в своих целях. Я цитирую слова женщины, на которую он ссылался. Цитата. Бывало так, что российские солдаты передавали сухпайок в подвал, а потом кидали туда гранату.
And then after lowering these rations, they tossed
Вы же хотели
grenades into the
процитировать это
basement.
интервью.
You wanted to quote that interview. Why didn't you quote the whole interview?
Это о вашей гуманитарной помощи,
This is about your
вслед которой
humanitarian
летит
assistance.
граната.
After you
Интервью, которое вы
provide
цитировали.
that humanitarian assistance, you toss
Та же самая
grenades.
женщина.
That's an interview from the same woman who you mentioned.
Now let me switch to English. I would like to make my further statement in response to the hypocritical questions by Putin's representative. After the video we saw with the shocking images from Bucha, Irpin, Matizhin, and other sites, he should ask these very questions to himself. How have Russians got to the cruelty of Nazis? When have you started enjoying acting like Nazis? Killing civilians, attempting to redraw internationally recognized borders, setting the task to finally resolve the Ukrainian issue, like Hitler attempted to resolve the Jewish issue. When did you miss the point of Russia's turning into the Nazi-style cancerous tumor? Unable and unwilling to stop expanding and bringing to neighboring nations sufferings, destruction, pain, and death. I'm appalled over your cynical and outright lie that you don't hit civilian targets And that is why you're moving so slowly. You hit the civilian targets and you kill the civilians. Shall I quote your own words of yesterday in the press conference that you gave here in the headquarters, where you said that civilians are killed by your army? Or shall I not? Shall I play the video? You said this is war. Civilians are killed in the war. It's a warfare, you said. Or perhaps in your mindset, a children's hospital in Mykolaiv, destroyed by the Russian strike yesterday, was a military target. And perhaps a child killed as a result of the strike was a Ukrainian nationalist. The only truth you've said is that you are not moving as planned. And the only reason is the resistance of the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian people, not your smart military planning. The Ukrainian people who realize quite clear what the Russian world in reality means. And we thank the international community for the solidarity with Ukraine. Ukraine will win in its territory. And the entire world will win, despite the threats that the criminal and the liar throws in the face just in the Security Council chamber. Finally, if there is anything that we have to thank the Russian representative for, it is his acknowledgement at yesterday's press conference that Russia is waging war against Ukraine. War, you said several times, not the special operation. And I consider this confession shall impact the UN assessment of what is going on in the center of Europe. Perhaps it was the unique moment when we should believe what a fully accredited representative says in the United Nations. Hence, once again, a reminder to Putin's diplomats. Ribbentrop denied any knowledge of concentration camps, racial extermination policies, yet was found guilty at Nuremberg war crime trial. And we all know what happened to him on the 16th of October, 1946. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Olof Skog, the head of delegation of the European Union to the United Nations.
Thank you, Madam President. I address the Security Council on behalf of the European Union and its member states. North Macedonia, Montenegro and Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Iceland and Liechtenstein, Republic of Moldova, Georgia, Monaco and San Marino all aligned themselves with this statement. And I wanted to start by congratulating you, Madam President, for the United Kingdom for assuming the presidency for the month of April and for convening this meeting and for inviting us to speak, and also acknowledge the presidency of March of the United Arab Emirates. I want to thank the Secretary General, Under Secretary Generals Di Carlo and Griffiths for their presentations, and I want to express our full support, solidarity and respect for the heroic people of Ukraine as embodied by the message this morning by President Zelensky. Madam President, 41 days ago, Russia decided to wage a war of aggression against Ukraine in blatant violation of international law, the principles of the UN Charter and of the acquis of the OSCE, an affront to the rules-based order and to the global security and stability. And we have heard and seen again today the tremendous cost to the people of Ukraine. The dramatic consequences of Russia's war of choice are well known. Thousands of lives have been lost. Over 11 million people, most of them women and children, have been forced to leave their homes. Over 500 schools and 52 hospitals have been shelled. Entire cities have been razed to the ground. The unfolding drama in Mariupol and the images from Bucha stain our common humanity. Russia must stop this senseless act of violence. The EU condemns in the strongest terms Russia's unjustified and unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine. We demand that Russia immediately stop its military aggression, immediately and unconditionally withdraw all forces from the entire territory of Ukraine, and fully respect Ukraine's territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence within its internationally recognized borders, as demanded by the United Nations General Assembly. We condemn in the strongest possible terms the reported atrocities committed by the Russian armed forces in a number of occupied Ukrainian towns. Haunting images of massacres with large numbers of civilian deaths and casualties, as well as destruction of civilian infrastructure, show the true face of Russia's brutal war of aggression. These massacres will be inscribed in the list of atrocities committed by Russia on European soil. The Russian authorities are responsible for these crimes committed while they had effective control of the area. They are subject to the international law of occupation. Russia is directing attacks against the civilian population and is targeting civilian objects, including hospitals, medical facilities, schools, and shelters. These war crimes must stop immediately. Those responsible will be held to account in accordance with international law. We welcome the International Court of Justice's provisional measures ordering Russia to suspend military operations immediately. We fully support the investigation launched by the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court into war crimes and crimes against humanity, as well as the work of the Independent Commission of Inquiry. The EU is assisting the Ukrainian Prosecutor General and civil society in the collection and preservation of evidence of the war crimes. It is clear there must be and there will be accountability. The EU and its member states are providing shelter for the more than 4 million refugees that fled Russia's violence. They do so regardless of nationality, ethnicity, religion, or race. We have adopted sanctions against the Russian government, its financial and defense sectors, and those individuals enabling and financing the aggression. We have committed significant funding to the UN Humanitarian Flash Appeal and regional refugee response plans for Ukraine. So far, the EU and its member states have mobilized over 1.1 billion euros in emergency aid. This comes on top of the 2.4 million euros in humanitarian emergency and early recovery assistance the EU and its member states have provided to Ukraine since 2014. In the largest ever operation under the EU Civil Protection Mechanism, 29 countries, all EU member states together with Norway and Turkey, have responded to the request for assistance from Ukraine. As of 4th of April, over 13,000 tons of medicines, hospital equipment, ambulances and firefighter equipment, food and energy supplies have arrived in Ukraine. European leaders have set up a Ukraine Solidarity Trust Fund to channel support to post-war reconstruction. And at the pledging event on 9th of April with Canada, we will further showcase that we stand in words and deeds with the courageous people of Ukraine. Madam President, after the Security Council was unable to take action, the General Assembly demonstrated once again less than 2 weeks ago the overwhelming international rejection of the Russian aggression and an overwhelming support to addressing the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. The international community demanded safe and unhindered passage for civilians fleeing violence, as well as humanitarian access to those in need. International humanitarian law must be respected. The dramatic consequences of Russia's war against Ukraine are not limited to Europe. They are global. Ukrainian farmers are prevented from sowing as a result of Russian shelling. Ships filled with wheat are blocked in Black Sea ports by Russian military forces. As a result, food prices have rocketed, pushing people into poverty and threatening to destabilize entire regions. The poorest countries, as we've heard, are the most vulnerable to shocks in food prices. All this is a direct result of the war, despite Russia's cynical attempts to shift the blame. Madam President, the EU and its member states are fully mobilized to end the war in line with international law and the UN Charter. But at the same time, crises the world over need our urgent attention. The EU will continue to provide humanitarian and development support to our partner countries from North Africa to the Middle East and from Sub-Saharan Africa to Asia. We are scaling up our multilateral action to provide support to countries with acute food insecurity and are committed to keeping global trade routes open so agricultural staples can feed the world. The EU has pledged 2.5 billion euros for international cooperation related to nutrition for the period 2021 to 2024. We also fully support the work of the UN to deliver and scaling up humanitarian assistance, protect refugees, and work towards a ceasefire. With a particular focus on food security, we will contribute to the work of the Global Crisis Response Group to deal with the global social and economic effects of the war. We heard your recommendations this morning, Secretary General, and we have already launched a strategy for safeguarding food security and reinforcing the resilience of food systems backed by increased assistance. Madam President, once again, we call on Russia to cease the destruction of innocent life across Ukraine and immediately and unconditionally withdraw all its troops. We call for an immediate ceasefire, safe passage to civilians trapped in war zones, and uninterrupted humanitarian access. We stand in solidarity with the people of Ukraine and all other people affected by the war of Russian aggression. We stand in support of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and we will continue to work diligently with the UN and our partners to end this aggression and address the humanitarian needs. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Skog for his statement. I also acknowledge the written statement submitted by the delegation of Poland earlier before the meeting, and also from the 8 Nordic Baltic countries. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned. Good afternoon. I'm going to make these remarks in my national capacity as the permanent representative of the United Kingdom. The Security Council has just met to discuss Russia's continued assault on Ukraine 40 days into the war, including the harrowing images and reports that came out of Bucha at the weekend. President Zelensky also addressed the Council following his visit to Bucha yesterday. President Zelenskyy's reports of the destruction and torture Russian soldiers carried out on Ukrainian civilians were extremely harrowing. He told us about the men and women who were shot in the streets with their hands tied behind their backs. He told us that women had been gang raped, including in front of their children. That people had had their limbs cut off and their tongues cut out. That Russian tanks had crushed Ukrainian families who sat in their cars, unable to escape. He told us that there must be accountability for these crimes. The UK, as current President of the Council and as a committed partner of Ukraine, will not rest until that has happened. And you'll remember that we were the early supporters of the ICC inquiry, which is now going on, and we welcome the announcement today from the Secretary General of an independent inquiry. Frankly, we found Russia blamed everyone else, but we've all seen the satellite images that show the bodies having been in Bucha for weeks. President Zelensky also called for the United Nations, the UN Security Council, and the international architecture to act on these war crimes and to reform if necessary. The United Nations was also clear. 11.3 million people have now been displaced. So we do need to investigate these crimes. And in his remarks, the Secretary General set out the global consequences: rising food prices, more than 50 developing countries with more than 1.2 billion people affected by the ripple effects of this war. We need to silence the guns. We're all clear about that. Thank you.
President Zelensky, do you agree with him on the statement when he said that there is Security Council, but there is no peace in the world? And he even asked to remove Russia from the Security Council or to reconsider the mechanism of how the United Nations and Security Council works. Do you agree with that, this statement?
I think it's true that the Security Council was set up to protect peace and security in the world, and in the light of Russia's veto, we have been very restricted in our ability to act. I think it's very welcome that we've seen the General Assembly act so decisively, both to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine and also to call for humanitarian support. And we've seen that in those strong votes that you've seen with 141 and 140 countries. But we do need to make sure that now and in the future, the Security Council and the UN as a whole is able to respond to these sort of challenges. And that's why we're very strong supporters of the Secretary General's common agenda, which will help drive through these reforms we need to see. Thank you.
Madam Ambassador, there seems to be a unanimous call for an independent investigation, not only in Bucha, but elsewhere in Ukraine. Can you perhaps talk about how soon that can happen and what the process is in that regard?
Well, the Secretary General announced today that he had asked for an independent inquiry, but we know that Karim Khan, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, is already in Ukraine, and his team is already in the business of collecting evidence, and that's a very sophisticated and important part of this. So we very much welcome those developments. Thank you.
That's a pile of bloody lies, nothing new. That's a clear desire to twist the situation and the reality. And as my president said on several occasions, we are for the full independent investigation. We are not living in the 18th, 19th, 20th century. We are living in the 21st century, where we have multiple high-tech means to verify the facts, including the satellite, forensics, and all other things.
Ambassador, President Zelensky failed the UN Security Council for preventing the war in Ukraine, but elsewhere, and he has given some examples, Syria, Afghanistan, and he called for a fair representation. Can the UN start, or can they start questioning the role of Russia, and how can they do it?
Well, the role of Russia is unquestionable. It's disastrous. I mean, that's a clear and a very effective immobilizer of on the way of fulfillment by the Security Council of the mandate. So there is a need, and I think that one of the outcomes of this tragedy, of this war, should be a real and serious revision of the way the Security Council functions. And if the entire international community, it's not only about Ukraine, it's about the entire international community, if the entire international community can trust the Security Council as it is today with the security, so there will be no switching to business as usual. Or if there is a switching to the business as usual, then, as my president said, this organization should dissolve itself.
Ambassador, the Russian ambassador just told me that the video that was just played, that is all fake as well.
What can I say? Of course it's fake. Of course, in the Russian mind it is. But as I said, I bring you back to my reply to the first question.
But how do you counter this, the constant...
I will not dignify the bunch and the torrent of lies. It is not my job to investigate and to verify. Ukraine is open to international investigation. All right? There are already satellite imagery. Satellites can read your text messages to your family on your smartphone. So satellites are able to do everything.
What should be the next step of the UN ambassador?
Was that?
What should be the next step?
The next step will be the consideration of suspension of the Human Rights Council membership of the Russian Federation, which is an appalling tumor on the Human Rights Council, using the language of Comrade Nibenza.
Ambassador, is there a set date on the action in the General Assembly? And also your president mentioned the creation of an alternative security architecture.
It's not the alternative security. I'm not sure that you're quoting properly. We can refer to the actual text, but the current security architecture as it stands is not capable to guarantee and provide security. That's a matter of fact, and you cannot deny it. So we must revisit the architecture, and we have to be responsible in setting up something that provides security to a Caribbean nation, to an African nation, to a Latin American nation, to a European nation, which happens, unfortunately, so far to be a neighbor to the Russian Federation. All right?
Are you going to bring forward in the coming days with your colleagues?
No, it's It's a very comprehensive subject that should be discussed thoroughly, but the discussion should not be a repetition of a marathon, a September marathon in the General Assembly. It should be a very thorough discussion after the war.
As for the GA vote, do you have a date on that?
No, we don't have a date. We are working with the office of the PGA. We are working with the Secretariat of the General Assembly as well. We are in the process of consultations with many countries. We will not do it single-handedly. We're not doing it on our own or with a minimum number of countries. That will be a cross-regional action. All right?
You don't get the support you need to remove Russia from the